And it was 2 hours delayed, then 3 hours, then 4 hours. It was like, every time we looked, it was like 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, 2 a.m. And then they had a tornado warning, so everyone in the airport was in the tunnel under the tarmac. It was just like mass humanity under there. And so it was something. Yeah, yeah.
What time did you end up home?
I got home at about noon today, or 11:30.
Okay.
So I got home and I said to my husband, just give me an hour. I fell asleep cold. I haven't been asleep that hard in that. So, whew. And he got me up and I was like, go away. Okay. Are we good, Joanne? All right, perfect. All right, hi, everybody. It is 6:30 p.m. on Tuesday, July 16th. We're here for a special meeting, a joint meeting of the East Bay Charter Township Planning Commission and Board of Trustees. Thank you, everybody, for being here, public, staff, consultants, and Planning Commission members, board members. We will call the meeting to order, and we will start with the Pledge of Allegiance, if you'll join me. I pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, Ann, can you do a roll call for both the Planning Commission and the Township Board?
Okay, Planning Commission first. Carl Ferguson.
Here.
Richardson.
Here.
Edward.
Here.
Leonard.
Here.
Walters.
Present.
Wassam.
Present.
And it's noted that Gonzalez is absent as is. And board members, Escorte.
Here.
Lyle.
Here.
Cook.
Here.
Bartlett.
Here.
M. Corte.
Here.
And Friend.
Here, thank you.
Is any of the board absent?
I'm still here.
Yeah, I called you once.
Which hat do you have on today? Plain. Half and half.
The multicolored one.
There you go.
Okay, with that, we'll move on to the agenda. Let's see, on the agenda today, we do have some minutes, although I'll note, I think the July 8th, we're going to put forward onto the August board meeting, and we don't have them in the packet, and I don't think they were quite ready, so that's fine, we'll do that. So we'll just strike that 5B. We'll leave the Planning Commission minutes of July 2nd. We have the business before the Township Board is the draft zoning ordinance and the residential lighting standards. So with that, is there any conflict of interest declared on either the board or the Planning Commission? Okay, we'll move on then. All right. Is there an approval of the agenda? And I think, Dan, I didn't introduce you as the chair of the Planning Commission, but I think everybody here knows that. So I think we'll just kind of run this in tandem, and we'll have a motion by your board for approval of the agenda, and then for my board for approval of the agenda, and then we'll just note that in the minutes, if that
Okay.
works.
Sounds good.
Okay.
What if I make the motion?
Well, then it depends who supports it, what motion it is. So if you want to go ahead, if there's a Planning Commission motion for the approval of the agenda.
I'll make a motion to approve the agenda for Tuesday, July 16th, 2024 of the joint planning and support.
Thank you. Motion by Mindy, seconded by Renee for approval of the agenda as stated. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, motion carries.
Okay, is there a motion by the Township Board for approval of the agenda? Okay. Okay, motion by Lyle, support by Escorte. Further discussion? All those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed by no? Okay, I will move forward with that agenda. Now, will the approval of the minutes is really just for your board meeting, so I'll let you go ahead and take that.
Sounds good. Any corrections, alterations, anything we need to discuss on July 2nd? And if not, we'd entertain a motion.
Do we need to do the site visits differently than, or do you want one with all of them?
Claire, should we just include that in the approval?
Yeah, just one motion for the entire.
Renee?
Technically, I was not at the site visits.
Made the second half of the second half.
I wasn't, yeah, I showed up for the second, okay, just letting you know.
So I make a motion to approve the site visit minutes as well as the Planning Commission meeting as of July 2nd, 2024.
Thank you. Support. Thank you. So, a motion by Rhonda, supported by Steve, for approval of the July 2nd, 2024 Planning Commission regular meetings and site visit meetings of that day. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? Motion carries. Back to you.
Okay, great. Well, this is our first opportunity for public comment. So I will have Ann go over the directions for public comment. And just note, we don't have a public hearing tonight, so the public comments should be directed either towards this space for public comment or for the last one at agenda item number 9. But with that, Ann, would you read the rules?
The purpose of the public comment is to give members of the public an opportunity to express their views and opinions to the members of this board. To maintain order and ensure fairness to every speaker, the following rules must be followed during public comment. Speakers will approach the podium and introduce themselves by stating their name and address and then proceed to make their comment. Each speaker will be limited to 3 minutes and is only allowed to speak once on the same matter. Communication previously emailed to the board is not necessary to be read aloud. Public comment time may not be given to another member of the public. Any arrangement for speaking on behalf of others must be arranged prior to the meeting. When your time is at 2 minutes 30 seconds, you'll be alerted with a yellow signal to wrap up your comment, and at 3 minutes, you will be alerted with the red signal, and the chair will ask you to wrap up your comments.
All right, very good, thank you. Right now, we will open the public comment, so if you would like to address the Planning Commission and Board together, please feel free to come up, introduce yourself at the podium, and let us know your perspective. Hi, how are you?
I'm good. I'm Nate Griswold. I own a company called Inhabitect here in Traverse City. My home address is 9450 East Harbor Hills Drive in Elmwood Township. I'm speaking on behalf of my company in this first one, and I'll speak on behalf of my parents on the second one. So I think there's a big missed opportunity in what I've read so far here, you guys, in green stormwater infrastructure. I don't see anything in this ordinance that calls out that specifically. In Habitat, we specialize in green infrastructure, landscape architecture, design, build landscapes, and across the board in most regions that I work in, when ordinances are being rewritten, green stormwater infrastructure is a big part of it. And I don't, unless I'm missing something, hopefully you can bring it out and show me where it's at. I've read through all the proposed amendments to the ordinance, and it's very restrictive too, from a landscaper perspective. And I think that that's the intent, but I think that also that is, you know, it really limits some properties, in particular stormwater management. Permeable pavement, I believe, should be a part of this for patios. I'm curious if there's been any studies that prove that wood decking with stain that has to be maintained is better for water quality than an inert product paving, permeable pavement. It's engineered, it's backed by landscape architectural stamps that you're requiring, so why is it not in here? That is something that should be here, and it's an oversight in my opinion. And I'd be happy to help you write it. I've helped write ordinances, stormwater ordinances from everywhere from New York City to San Francisco to Miami, Portland, Oregon, Seattle, everything to incentivize green stormwater infrastructure, and it should be a part of your ordinance here. You're making a big change here, and I think that protecting the environment is number one, and that's what I do at Inhabitect every day, and I'd like to see it in your ordinance. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Additional public comment? Hello, how are you?
Good evening, Caitlin Flensky, East Bay Township resident. Thank you to everyone that has been so heavily involved in the draft rewrite process. The active participants have shown their due diligence, that they're listening to public comment, and really working hard to make this a more comprehensible, easy to follow ordinance. I have only 3 concerns regarding the new draft language. Number 1, while I appreciate that a land use permit will now be required to apply for an accessory use, what about pre-existing properties and/or non-conforming uses? I believe the new verbiage that defines an accessory use is missing a key detail from the current ordinance. Under the current language, section 221.2C states, "An accessory use shall not generate any effects on neighboring properties, including but not limited to noise, parking, traffic, glare, or dust, greater than or more burdensome than such impacts from the main use on the property." This verbiage, or something very similar to it, needs to be included in the new ordinance. GoRec, Lakemore, and TC Water Sports are all examples where this exact point was used to assist you in defining and enforcing an accessory use. Please add some version of 2C back into the new draft. Second one, please remove section 4.36B2, at least from the lakes area. This section allows temporary dwelling units or camping on your property that is not to exceed 7 consecutive days or a total of 60 days in a calendar year. Who is going to count the number of days, and how will that ever be monitored? Specifically in the lakes area, septic systems are sized according to the number of bedrooms in a home. A temporary dwelling unit would put undue stress and overcapacity on septic systems that are very close in proximity to our inland lakes. Temporary dwelling units are not currently allowed in the lakes area. Accessory dwelling units will continue to not be allowed in the lakes area, so temporary dwelling units should not be allowed either. It's opening a huge potential issue in monitoring and enforcement. Please do not codify something that is not safe for the lakes area. And the last one, the marina definition should not specify East Grand Traverse Bay only. We all know marinas are not allowed in the lakes area. Yet within the last few years, at least one riparian property in the lakes area has received a letter of violation from East Bay Township staff stating that they are operating a marina illegally in the lakes area. And this is still a current ongoing problem. If the new definition of marina specifies only East Grand Traverse Bay, how will violations of this nature in the lakes area be addressed? Please remove that specification of the bay in the marina definition. I ask that you discuss these specific details during tonight's meeting. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Further public comment? Hello.
Good morning, good afternoon, evening. Good evening, Commissioners and Trustees. Judy Nemitz, East Bay Township. Thank you to Ms. Carner for her leadership, the subcommittee, the consultants, the Planning Commission, the Board of Trustees, and the citizens who have participated throughout this process. I applaud you for reviewing the lighting ordinance, as light pollution is the easiest pollution to mitigate now. Now I'd like to talk to you about temporary dwellings. I sincerely ask you to deeply think about 4.37B2 temporary dwellings in the Pine Grove and the Lakes area. Trustee Walters even suggested that this be reviewed by zoning district. I have a few questions. Will temporary dwellings become short-term rentals? Houseboats, RVs, campers? Accessory dwelling units are not permitted in the Lakes area, so why will temporary dwelling units? Keyholing in the lakes area will become a problem if this is permitted. What about sanitation and access to potable water? What about the health codes? How will this be monitored? Is the township prepared to have this be a police power ordinance, as this is an activity on the land like blight, junk, health codes? And will this be enforced 24/7? Or is this a zoning ordinance, which is a land use and enforced Monday through Thursday? Again, it's going to be pretty hard to monitor 7 consecutive days, 60 calendar days a year. I'm not sure how that's going to be enforced. Another thing, taxes on residential dwellings sustain this township. Single-family homes are the bulk. Temporary dwellings have the benefits without the monetary responsibility of higher taxes and infrastructure costs and that support this township. Lastly, 41 years ago, I bought 2 properties in the Lakes area. I researched temporary dwellings because I didn't want to build in an area that had transient or temporary housing and without proper codes, meeting proper codes. Please, don't undo 41 years of zoning with a wave of the pen tonight. We have 15 campgrounds in a 20-mile radius that are zoned such. They have appropriate facilities for pumping and dumping, and they also have management on site. This is why we have zoning, so that we make sure that appropriate codes and ordinances and activities fit the neighborhood and community. Please remove 4.37B2. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Additional public comment? Hello.
Carol Crusoe, East Bay. I support the comments made by my fellow citizens this evening, Ms. Nemitz and Ms. Falinsky. Just need to do a little more research about that green infrastructure. Mostly what I'm here tonight to talk about is the dark skies or regulating lighting in the residential area. When a concept such as dark skies becomes an international concept and is included in local media, and it's certainly time to discuss its relevance at the township level. I urge you to understand and do further research that will explain that the excessive night lighting is not simply a nuisance to some. It's more than that. Included in an email I sent to you today are 3 different resources. First is a copy of our local magazine with an article in it on how and why nighttime light pollution should and could be reduced. In part, it says, quote, light pollution affects everything from animal migration to melatonin, a hormone that our bodies produce when it's dark, and that hormone helps us to sleep. Beyond sleep deprivation, fatigue, headache, stress, anxiety, recent studies show a connection between reduced melatonin levels and cancer. That cancer is different in men and women because it's hormonal related. The adverse effects of excessive night lighting are so impactful that the American Medical Association has recommended changes to decrease it. A second resource that I gave to you in your email is a link to a website by the Dark Skies International. It defines dark skies, its effects on wildlife and human health, it's how it wastes money and energy and contributes to climate change, and how it blocks our views of the universe. Remember, East Bay Township, is a community that values nature and the great outdoors. That website also lists dark sky-friendly lighting equipment. It outlines responsible lighting practices as being useful, targeted, warm-colored, low-level, controlled, as in using timers or motion-activated. And most importantly of all, it's a website that contains a database on lighting policy and ordinances, and that was put together or collected in collaboration with the University of Arizona. Third in your email is this book, a third resource. It's an easy and interesting read that provides a plethora of explanations, examples, and solutions in its 9 chapters. Weeks ago, I gave a copy of one of the chapters to the planning and zoning staff as an example. I strongly urge you to recommend that a subcommittee be formed to explore the many options and the many details for expanding the lighting standards to some or all of the residential districts. Please note, that the impacts of night lighting is significantly amplified when reflected off the water. In 2022, a tree subcommittee was recommended by the Planning Commission and formed under the direction of Claire Carner. Several changes and additions in the ordinance draft that you're reviewing tonight and are outlined as work for one of our current interns came directly from that tree subcommittee. Please do the same. Recommend that the formation of a residential lighting subcommittee to explore detailed options for a residential lighting ordinance.
Thank you, Carol. Additional public comment? Hello.
Good evening. My name is Brandon Falensky, East Bay Township resident, more specifically the Lakes area. And I'd like to share with you all an article from the Michigan State University Extension. It was written by a gentleman named Ryan Coffey, and it is entitled, "The One Question Every Municipality Should Ask Itself Before Adopting an Ordinance." For many Michigan municipalities, adopting a new ordinance or amending an existing ordinance can be a daunting task. Not only must they make sure that they are in compliance with the Michigan Zoning Enabling Act and other related laws, they must also develop legal language that achieves desired results while avoiding any unintended consequences. This process can often be a long, time-consuming, and costly one, as municipalities may need to hire a planner or attorney to develop and review the proposed language. Additionally, enacting a new ordinance can sometimes lead to significant public input and debate during its development process. As proposed, new ordinances often arise to address serious current issues in the municipality. Even when not facing a current zoning quote-unquote crisis, the development of a new ordinance should be a deliberate, thought-out process that identifies community need, reviews both regulatory and non-regulatory options, gathers community feedback, reviews sample language, develops a draft document, and identifies enforcement issues. This process is one most municipalities across Michigan are familiar with and regularly follow when adopting or amending an ordinance. However, there's a critical question that many municipalities fail to ask themselves, and perhaps it is the most important question of all. Do we have the will to enforce the ordinance we adopt? A zoning ordinance is law. It can be enforced, and violators can be ticketed, fined, appear before the courts, and in extreme cases end up in jail. However, a municipality has the responsibility and the duty to enforce its ordinances consistently and fairly. In not doing so, a municipality runs the risk of undermining the validity of their ordinance in court if they do not regularly enforce the ordinance, or worse yet, selectively enforce it. This issue can often be a particular problem in smaller rural communities where everybody knows each other and there appears to be a more relaxed approach to zoning enforcement. A zoning administrator must conduct their duties in according to the letter of the law. They must do what the zoning ordinance prescribes and do not have the latitude to deviate from the ordinance. The legislative body must support the zoning administrator in their consistent enforcement of the zoning ordinance. This support extends beyond initial enforcement by the zoning administrator to include financial and legal support if the township needs to go to court to enforce or defend its ordinance. If the municipality does not like some of the effects of a particular ordinance or is concerned about the costs of enforcing the ordinance, nonconformance is not an option. The municipality should either review and amend the particular ordinance or remove it entirely. Prior to adopting the new ordinance language, the municipality must have a serious discussion as to whether, once adopted, they will have the will to fully support the ordinance consistent with enforcement of the ordinance. So with that, tonight, I'm curious to hear discussion regarding this next read-through of the proposed ordinance, and does this township have the will to enforce the words that are on the page? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Additional public comment? Hello, how are you?
I'm good. Dustin Flasco. I live in Blair Township, but I grew up in East Bay. When I was a kid, I rode my bike around every one of these lakes, lost and otherwise. With the ordinance, similar to Nate's point, I believe a lot of the language is to protect our water, protect our runoff, protect our lakes, protect property that we're all sharing. Permeable pavements is a way to do that. It's growing 30% across the country, particularly in municipalities. It's a way to collect stormwater, recharge the system, cool the water, filter the water, and then within that system, biodegrade pollutants. I've got a stack of case studies, not just around the state, not from manufacturers, but from around the world. This is a solution to a lot of problems that we're having on the lakefronts, a lot of pollution issues that we're having. It is an answer. It's an answer for retention ponds. It's a answer for stormwater runoff. It's a solution for a lot of issues that we're having, and it's overlooked and it's denied. I just have to ask what the purpose is. If we've got papers from conservancies across the country, across the world, why this would be something that's denied. We can look at decks and, sorry, if you have a deck, you're going to paint it, you're going to stain it, and where does that go? That goes right into the soil. We can filter that soil. We can filter the contaminants through the soil, the phosphates, all these different pollutants that are on the lakefront. So I feel like we're missing a huge opportunity. I have vested interest. I'm a landscaper. We're permeable certified. We've done shoreline work for the township. We're not out to create problems. We're not out to create runoff. We're not out to pollute lakes. We're out to solve these issues. So I feel like that's something that should be strongly considered. I can offer you pages and pages of case studies from across the world to help with that process. We can bring specialists in. We've dealt with environmental companies. We've dealt with engineers. We've dealt with conservancies all over the world, well, all over the country, with papers from all over the world to back those facts. So I feel like if we're letting this go, we're missing an opportunity. You're missing an opportunity where, you know, it is a solution in a lot of other places, especially at other townships in the county. So that's what I have. So
Thank you.
thank you.
Any additional public comment? Okay, seeing no further public comment, we'll move on our agenda. We are at correspondence. Claire, we had a couple come in today.
Yeah, those have been received by all members of the Planning Commission and Township Board. We received 3 pieces of correspondence, all related to lighting, residential lighting from 3 residents, Ann Post, Patty Hirschberger, and Carol Kusel. So you have copies of all 3 of those.
All right, very good, thank you. Any questions on correspondence, or did anyone not receive them? I think we all did, yeah. All right, with that, we'll move on to business before the board and commission. First is the draft zoning ordinance review and discussion. So as everybody's aware, this is a culmination of an effort that started with redevelopment ready communities that the township is engaged in through the MEDC. As we have done an overhaul, I guess you could say, on the master plan that was finished a couple of years ago, and then we dove into the zoning ordinance rewrite. And so we've been working on that for over a year, and lots of meetings regarding that. I think we will go with this is we will start with our consultant. Joe Tangari is here, and he also has Andy with him from Giffords and Webster, who have worked very closely with township staff and subcommittee, and also legal counsel in drafting the ordinance. And we welcome you, and if you would kind of go over the approach that you've taken, the formatting, and those types of things. And then we will go from Giffords Webster, then we'll take it back to staff to kind of talk about some of the policy points that are in the new draft that's before the Planning Commission and the Township Board. And again, this has gone through, as Claire's setting that up, this has gone through a zoning ordinance subcommittee, and then it has gone to the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission has been meeting twice a month, utilizing the second meeting to go over this draft ordinance, and then that is coming to the Township Board for our input, and then that input will go back to the Planning Commission for a public hearing, correct? And looking at scheduling that public hearing within the next month to 2 months for sure. So with that, I think we'll turn it over to Joe. How are you tonight? How are you this evening?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Good.
It's good to be here.
Thank you for being here. It's nice to have you in person. Usually we see you on Zoom.
Yeah, I'm usually up on a screen. Screen is not showing what I'm seeing. being that we went to use the local computer because we knew it would work.
Yeah, right now it's just the blue screen.
Sometimes it's finicky, so. There you go.
All right.
We're especially excited about this because one of the primary reasons I think that we chose Giffords and Webster was really their formatting. It's unique amongst all of the applications we received and the requests for proposals, so.
Sure, well, thank you for that intro, because I will be showing you the format this evening. We're going to take a little tour of the new ordinance. Yes, this project has been going on for a little while now. We met for the better part of a year with the zoning subcommittee, and that had representatives from all the different boards and the staff. And the zoning subcommittee's primary job was to set some policy direction for the ordinance, and then help develop the language that, and review the language that ultimately wound up in the draft. And then we brought it to the Planning Commission once the steering committee was satisfied with where the language was. And the zoning ordinance has been reviewed by the Planning Commission over the last several months, and some changes have been made on the basis of those discussions. Of course, the public was invited to comment at all steering committee and planning commission meetings, and a lot of things that wound up in the ordinance are direct responses to comments that we had from the public. And now we're kind of near the end of the process where we're reviewing this with both the township board and the planning commission, so that everybody gets comfortable with where we are and we identify any perhaps last minute changes that we might want to make, and then it will go to a public hearing at the Planning Commission, who will then send it to the Township Board for final adoption. I will start this little tour basically just by going over the structure of the ordinance, because the zoning ordinance today has a lot of different sub-articles. This ordinance has been organized into a 7-article structure, which you can see here in the general table of contents. So we have a purpose and intent section that establishes the legal authority for creating a zoning ordinance. It tells the public what the title of the ordinance is and all the other little kind of legal things that we have to support us having an ordinance in the first place. The definition section defines terms that are used in specific ways within the ordinance. The zoning districts establishes the actual districts that you see on the zoning map, which is also included in the ordinance. Use standards is standards that are specific to particular uses that are permitted in the township. Article 5 is site standards, so that's things like landscaping, lighting, dumpster enclosures, things that affect the way a site is going to be developed aside from the use itself. Article 6 is development procedures, so that's how you do site plan review and special land use review and zoning permits and other things. And then Article 7 is administration and enforcement. So that's where we lay out how the township handles nonconformities, the roles and responsibilities of the Zoning Board of Appeals and other boards and staff members, and performance guarantees and things like that. This ordinance has a second table of contents, which gets into more detail. It actually lays out all the different subsections of the ordinance. So if you want to go straight to one of them, you just click on the title and it will take you right there. You can also just go back to that using these little buttons on the bottom. Another thing that we have at the end of the ordinance, it has nothing in it yet because we haven't done any amendments to this, but there is a schedule of amendments at the very end of the ordinance. So anytime you amend your ordinance, what you did is recorded here. If you have an ordinance number for the adoption, that'll be included in there as well, the date. So it's a nice little catalog of everything you've done with your zoning ordinance since you adopted it. Diving into the articles of the ordinance themselves, as I noted, Article 1 is the purpose and intent. It's the basic language that sets up the framework of the ordinance. A lot of that's carried forward from the current ordinance. Some of the things were updated. That's definitely the shortest article of the ordinance. Definitions is the second one. So this has its own sub-table of contents that gives you all the defined terms, allows you to click on any one of them to see what the definition is. So I just clicked on driveway approach, and there's the definition there at the bottom of the page. Back. Oops. That's divided into a couple of different sections. One is rules applying to text. So if you're wondering what that is, it's kind of what do we mean when we say shall? You know, that means it's mandatory. When we say may, it's permissive. So we're setting up some rules for how to interpret the text of the ordinance here. Then we're defining all the terms, and then we have some rules of measurement. How do you apply some of the measurements that you might need to do in using the ordinance? Article 3, that's where the zoning districts are. So these are your zoning districts. And each one of these districts has its own two-page spread where we talk about what the purpose of the district is, and this is rooted in your master plan. And then we have what can I do in the district, so permitted uses, special land uses. Over on the other page, you have your development standards. So how big does a lot need to be in this district? What are the setbacks? What's the maximum height? That's all over here, and we've got some illustrations to illuminate what those numbers mean. If you see any text in blue in the ordinance is a link. So if I wanted to find out what rules apply to bed and breakfast specifically, I can click on that and it takes me to Article 4 where the standards for bed and breakfasts are. And then if I want to go back to Article 3, I just go through the links again. So every district has this kind of setup. This number 5 down here will point you to other standards in the ordinance that are going to be relevant to whatever you're doing in that district. But there are also some other things in Article 3, how we interpret zoning district boundaries, the whole framework for how we permit uses, which is permissive zoning. We're not telling you what you can't do in a district, we're telling you what you can do, and if it's not listed, then it's presumed that it's not available there. And then there are some additional supplemental standards for various districts and some other things like our density bonus standards and exceptions to our rules, and then our environmentally sensitive area supplemental standards are in here as well. It's probably the most discussed section of the ordinance during the steering committee process. Article 4 is fairly straightforward. As I said, it's the use standards. So if you're looking to do a car wash, there are some standards that apply to that, and they're right here in section 412. The site standards section begins with accessory buildings. All of our parking and loading standards are in there. Signs, zoning lots, clear vision areas is basically trying to ensure that someone pulling out of a driveway or a street isn't going to have their view of oncoming traffic impeded by some, obstruction that's going to block their view. Landscaping and buffering, access control, private roads, dumpster enclosures, screening mechanical equipment, pedestrian-oriented commercial design, exterior lighting, sanitary standards, stormwater detention, and sidewalks and pathways all have their own sections in there. Stormwater detention does refer you to other standards. That's not embodied in the zoning ordinance. It's actually its own ordinance. 6, again, this is pretty straightforward. It's site plan review and all the other zoning or development review processes that you have. We formatted the requirements for applications as tables so that we can pull those out and put them in a development review guide, which is going to be the final product that gets developed for this project. Once the ordinance is adopted, we put that together and we hand it off to staff, and then they have that document that they can update over time going into the future, and that basically is intended to make everybody's job easier by putting all of the flow charts and things for processes in one place for staff to take a quick glance at, or for someone to look at on your website and kind of understand the process before they even come in. Plan unit development is in Article 6 too, if you're ever looking for it. And then Article 7, again, is pretty straightforward. It's the administration and enforcement section. So things like, if we're requiring a bond or we're charging a fee for something, that's all covered in here. Now, some other things about this document. It has these footer links at the bottom, so they go to a few different places. This little house goes home to the table of contents. This I goes to a section called How to Use This Ordinance, and it's just basically a guide to what everything you're seeing in the ordinance means. So it shows you the 2-page spread for the districts. This little book symbol will show up a lot through the ordinance, and that means that's a defined term, and you can look it up in the definitions. And then there are a few other things that show up in our diagrams, like this little PL symbol, which means property line. Also in that how to use this ordinance section is a use matrix. This is a table that lays out what's permitted by district throughout the entire township. And it's basically designed to give you a quick guide so that if you're, let's say you have a particular use you want to do, you can find it in the table and then see which districts is in, rather than going through each district and trying to find it in the lists. That also includes a summary of the district standards. So you've got all the districts laid out with their minimum lot sizes and setbacks and things in this table here. And then the zoning ordinance is at the end of that section. And I'll dip away from that for a second, because this little locator icon takes you to the zoning map. So another thing that was done as part of this process is that we devised a lot of new illustrations for the standards. So for instance, if you go into definitions, a lot of these terms are going to have illustrations that go with them. So for instance, when you click on lot, there's an illustration that shows you, well, here's what constitutes a corner lot, here's what constitutes a through lot, an interior lot. These are terms that most people aren't used to working with every day. So illustrations just help make everything a lot clearer, and there are quite a few of them distributed throughout the ordinance. Most of them are in, well, there's one for every district in Article 3, but Article 2, the definitions, and Article 5, the site standards, have a lot of illustrations in them. And, I mean, that's basically the document. It's meant to be easy to move around in. I have a printed version here. You can see prints with the exact same formatting that you see in the PDF, where you get your spread. And if you print it double-sided, you'll get the same formatting. Things don't slide around on the page based on how it prints out or things. It's got a fixed format. Yeah, and then in addition to the footer links, there's the sidebar links, which take you to each article's table of contents. And I think that is the handoff to Claire for the policy summary that she's going to give you.
Joe, let me just real quick, one thing mentioned, the amendment section that you talked about. One of the things I think it's important to point out to not only our board members, the public as well, but, writing a zoning ordinance is part of a process, right, based on the master plan. And amending that after it's instituted is a natural part of that process. I mean, as Claire has utilized our current ordinance and has had a list of things to change, that will begin again anew with this, and that's kind of a perfectly natural, normal part of the process.
Absolutely, yeah. A zoning ordinance is a living document. It never stops being changed, if you're doing it right, that is, because you're always going to have to respond to something new that you didn't anticipate back when you originally wrote it. Things change all the time. And then also, more houses get built over time in an area, and that changes the character of the area. You do a new master plan, you have a different vision for that area perhaps, then you've got to reflect that in your zoning ordinance to implement your master plan. So, over time, you will definitely amend your ordinance, and that's just kind of the way of things.
Okay. Does anybody on either the board or the commission have any questions for Joe at this point? Okay, I want to thank you so much for your work on this. We've enjoyed working with you. I think everybody has at every level, and we'll turn it over to Claire to talk about some of those, key policy points.
Thanks, guys. Okay. So in your packet, we tried to put together, because there's a ton of policy discussions that's been had between zoning ordinance subcommittee, planning commission with the 4 work sessions. We wanted to highlight some of the key policy changes, but also not talk at you for the whole evening, have an opportunity for the board and planning commission to be able to discuss. And so I did want to highlight some of those policy changes and some of the areas that we spent a lot of time. So you'll see in your packet, it's page 8. It's got, it says East Bay Township zoning ordinance overview of proposed changes related to housing. So as you'll recall, some of the changes that we're looking at related to housing are an area where we're making a lot of policy changes, or we have proposed a number of policy changes.
Claire, we had a presentation by Yarrow Brown. This is what she had looked at, correct? The draft zoning ordinance and some of the changes?
We've made a few changes since then, as the planning commission reviewed it, but yes, she was looking at some of these changes.
Okay, thank you.
With that presentation. So we're looking at, for the maximum dwelling density in low-density residential, moderate, and high-density, increasing that up to where we are with the master plan. So increasing those densities in line with our adopted master plan. So low density, we're looking at 5 units per acre. Moderate density at 8, which that's actually already been approved by the township because there was a text amendment proposed by a developer. And then we're looking at, for the high density, bumping that up to 12. For the minimum dwelling size, you'll see the current minimum dwelling sizes based on district and whether it's single family or multifamily. We're looking at getting rid of those minimum dwelling sizes and just referring to county building code. So as long as it meets county building standards and requirements, then it would be permitted by the township. For minimum lot area and minimum lot width, we're looking at adjusting those just to make sure that those, the sizes and widths are consistent with the underlying density that we're allowing. So in our current ordinance, we have a certain density allowances, but then the lot width and the lot size are wildly different than those, and so you can't actually achieve the density that the ordinance allows for. One important point that I did want to make is that if you don't have municipal water and sewer, regardless of the district that you're in, you still are required to have that lot width. I believe it's 150 feet and a minimum size of 40,000 square feet. So still sticking with the zoning, the current zoning ordinance requirements if you don't have municipal water and sewer. In terms of what's permitted by right in our residential districts, we are making changes particularly to the low-density residential, which, as you know, that's much of the township within the urban growth boundary. Much of that is the yellow in the back there, our low-density residential. So right now, we basically allow single-family detached homes in low-density residential. We are expanding that to allow duplexes, group daycare as a use by right. We're also allowing townhomes, triplexes, and quadplexes as through special land use permit. So that's definitely a change that you'll note moving forward. We also have provision for infill and density bonuses in all of our districts within the urban growth boundary. So for low-density residential, we're looking at allowing multiple units on a single parcel, depending on the size of the parcel. So if you have a larger parcel, there's a table in there that allows you to have up to 1, 2, 3, or even 4 units on your parcel. For moderate density and high density residential, we're looking at allowing a density and height bonus of up to 25% if the applicant commits to providing for workforce housing. So there's some specific requirements. We're also looking at universal access, looking at beta stop. So there's a certain criteria that you need to meet, but one of the criteria that definitely would need to be met would be workforce housing. Based on state and county definitions of that. The other thing related to residential density that I just want to make sure everyone is aware of, this is also reflected in our master plan, but we're changing the minimum lot area. So for the lakes area, for the agriculture district, and for the Boardman River, the current minimum lot area is 1 acre, it's 40,000 square feet. We're bumping that up to 2 acres. So that's going to have ramifications for, someone that owns maybe a 3-acre parcel, they're planning to split it in the future, they would not be allowed to based on this draft, the way the ordinance is drafted. So I did want to highlight that change.
And the purpose of that is basically, as I understand it, is as you move that minimum acreage up, you're negating against sprawl, basically, outside of that growth boundary.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing, over the last several years, we've seen a demand for kind of like residential cluster subdivisions in our agricultural district. So coming in 100 acres, you can put 100 units. And so looking at that development pattern is not consistent with what the master plan has, for years kind of prescribed for that, for those districts outside the urban growth boundary.
Okay.
So is there a desire to discuss some of these, or do you want me to go through, do you prefer that I go through all of the policy changes, or would you like to discuss
I think let's go through all of the policy
Okay.
changes, and then we'll come back with some specific
Sounds
questions.
good. So moving on to an overview of, this is on page 9 of your packet, overview of changes related to environmentally sensitive areas. So you'll see with the setbacks, our waterfront setbacks from inland lakes, from streams, and from East Grand Traverse Bay, they were variable. We've changed them so that they're all consistent 50 feet. So regardless of the water body, whether it's Mitchell Creek, Baker Creek, or an unnamed creek, whether it's an inland lake or East Grand Traverse Bay, the setback from the ordinary high water mark will be 50 feet. We're keeping all the setback requirements for the Boardman River. A few changes that we've made related, we are now currently in our current ordinance, we don't regulate wetlands. With the new draft, we're requiring a 25-foot setback from all Eagle regulated wetlands. We are limiting permitted structures within the floodplain as defined by FEMA. We are limiting the ability to build on steep slopes, which is anything in excess of 15%, and we're also requiring grading permits. So there's definitely some changes there with some of the environmentally sensitive areas beyond just waterfront areas that were not part of the existing ordinance. Looking at the vegetative buffer strip, we've made some changes. Moving forward, we are, in terms of vegetation removal, if there's any work being done in that 50-foot setback, basically not permitting any removal of vegetation. So keeping an allowance for a pathway of 5 feet, keeping an allowance for a 200 square foot waterside deck, but beyond that, and allowing like a filtered view of the water, but beyond that, really not allowing for any vegetation removal in that 50-foot setback. And also a requirement, if you're doing work in that 50-foot setback, to proactively reestablish the vegetative buffer. We also are no longer allowing for artificial beaches or turf grass within that 50-foot buffer. So those are the main changes. You'll see there's a number of other items on here that have not changed between the current ordinance and the updated draft. And then getting into some of the site standards, did want to just highlight we're making substantial changes to landscaping and buffering. We have a requirement for native species, no invasive, so 90% of like a commercial site plan is required to have native species. We are a lot more prescriptive with the landscaping requirements, so requirements for planting buffer along parking areas and street frontage, requiring 80% of a street-facing facade to have like the foundation planting, requirement for parking lot islands, curb extensions, requiring a tree protection plan, as well as requirements for major and minor green belts depending on adjacent land uses. So I think Matt Cook probably remembers we discussed quite a bit with the tree preservation subcommittee. Right now, you can have a high-density residential right next to, low-density residential or commercial next to. We don't really have any requirements for berms, green belts. Now we have a lot more. It's a larger and more significant green belt if you have a very low intense use right next to a higher intense commercial use. We are much more prescriptive with that. We also are looking more closely at like pedestrian-oriented commercial design and have made a number of changes. Requirements for non-motorized pathway and/or sidewalk to be along the street frontage based on our non-motorized map. Requirements for some facade and architectural design standards for commercial developments, primary entrance facing the street, parking in the back of the building. Some of those new urbanist design requirements are being integrated into all of our commercial districts. And then I just wanted to, kind of more broadly, looking at the whole ordinance, did want to highlight, looking at our use tables, we've consolidated a lot of uses. So even though there's still a lot of uses, you're going to see that there's a lot fewer uses. So like, for example, we had multiple different types of retail. We've consolidated into more of like a retail use because the parking standards and kind of the overall impact of those various retail uses are pretty similar, and so we're regulating them more generally as opposed to specifically. We've got a number of different new uses that have been added into the ordinance. We have agritourism, we have artisan manufacturing, outdoor cafes, hospitals and overnight surgery centers is a new use that wasn't previously in there, rehabilitation centers, public versus private parks, studio for the performing arts. Those are all new terms that have been added. Alternative energy is another one that is a hot topic right now, and so now we actually have standards and provisions related to wind energy, to solar, to large-scale energy storage. We also have updated requirements related to childcare home, childcare center, adult foster care, adult structured daycare, really looking to remove the barriers and defer to state licensing requirements for those uses. Accessory buildings is one that I'm particularly excited about. We have a lot of special land use permits related to larger pole barns, and so this new ordinance bases the size of your pole barn on the size of your property as opposed to your home. And so much, I think, less restrictive in terms of being able to build a, larger garage or storage building, with still having some limitations and requirements for special land use permit if it's really large, buffering, screening, those types of things. We're looking at updating private road standards. One example is we've reduced the right-of-way from 66 feet to 50 feet. So the current private road standards are basically a replica of county requirements for public roads. And so with the understanding that many of these roads, all of these roads will not, in the future become county roads, but allowing some more flexibility for design so that it's not quite as much space. And we're finding there's limitations in terms of, how home setbacks and what you can fit within that 66 feet. I did want to make a few just quick clarifications on some of the items that came up for public comment. We are looking, so separate from the zoning ordinance, as you know, we have a stormwater ordinance, and so we're working with Wade Trim to rewrite that, to make some changes to the stormwater ordinance, and one big item that we're looking at is green infrastructure, and so you will see that conversation coming back to Planning Commission and likely Township Board, looking at a number of changes, one specifically more innovative green infrastructure provisions. The permeable pavers, as planning commissioners probably recall, that came to the Planning Commission as a text amendment a couple of years ago. There was a lot of discussion about permeable pavers. What we had proposed was to allow for permeable pavers 200 square feet in the waterfront setback. The Planning Commission ultimately decided there's concerns about maintenance of those systems and just the contractors installing those systems correctly. And so that was the Planning Commission ultimately decided not to move forward on that. I think there is an opportunity as we look at our stormwater ordinance and maintenance of, permeable pavement will likely be a discussion as part of the stormwater ordinance. I think it would be appropriate to revisit that as an option in the future. So those were just a few items that I had, but wanted to give time for deliberation by the boards.
Okay, thank you, Claire. Appreciate all the work that has gone into this. I would like to ask Planning Commissioner specifically, because this was before the Planning Commission and brought to the Township Board as request on feedback. And I just wanted to make sure if there was anything in particular planning commissioners wanted to have feedback on, like specifically that they had an interest in, that they were struggling with at the planning commission level. They said, geez, I would like to hear what the township board had to say. If there was anything like that, there doesn't have to be anything that you mentioned, but did want to give you that opportunity. Or we could just go straight into some questions as well. Okay, Mindy, you're on the board, so I'm going to hold back with you 1 second and just give your other board members a chance, and then we'll get to you. Does that sound okay? All right. Any of Mindy's colleagues on the Planning Commission?
The only thing I was going to pipe in to say is I got to tell you that the public input that we've received was pretty significant, even outside of the zoning committee, which is a godsend. And that being said, I think that there's been a lot of due diligence that's gone in. Some of those meetings were quite lengthy in going through a lot of the review. So believe me, there's been a lot of eyes on all of this. I will also acknowledge something that Joe said earlier, in working with zoning codes and the updates. It's not perfect. I can promise you that, and I know we're going to find things along the way. But I also feel confident in our crew to, at least take these challenges on as they pop up if there are things that we've overlooked or missed or need to clean up. It's life, it's just not perfect, but I think it's a heck of a lot better standing than where we were about a year ago. And we've heard a lot of, I think, positive feedback from the public along that way as well. So for what it's worth, I think it's a heck of an improvement, and kudos to, Joe and Andy for sticking with us and the late nights and a lot of the virtual conversations that we've had and getting us to where we are today.
Good, thank you, Dan, and thank you for chairing those meetings, and I think that those are good points. So if there wasn't anything else from them, Mindy, go ahead.
So one of the things that I wanted to bring up and talk about is the parking standard, specifically the parking standard in the regional business district and hotels and motels. We made some changes recently and allowed for some, bonuses, if you will, if there's, bike racks and chart trail availability and that kind of thing. But when we look at the parking standards specifically for hotels and motels, and what is proposed right now is, half a parking space per hotel unit, because, we talked a lot about the fact that families come in and they get multiple hotel units, and so they don't need, multiple parking spaces when they're taking up 2, 3, whatever it is. But one of the things that we didn't consider in that was those units that have multiple bedrooms in them, and the fact that those units themselves are 2, 3, however many bedrooms. And just wanted to make sure that we're not being too lenient with the half a parking space per room. And maybe we need to look at how many rooms are in a unit a little bit. I am not for having so many parking spaces that are unused. That's not what I am at, but I'm just concerned that maybe we got too far lenient, and maybe somewhere in the middle is where we need to be, or very specifically looking at how many bedrooms and not just how many units there are. So
Okay.
I just, wanted to bring that up and have discussion on that, because Planning Commission's talked about it a lot. We've made lots of changes and allowed for some unique parking, but I just want to make sure that we're not, in this proposed, getting too lenient.
That's great feedback. That's kind of the struggle. I wanted to see if there were any of those types of issues that you were specifically looking for feedback on. Okay, great. With that, I think we'll go back to pretty much the entire 300-page document and those issues that Claire was going over, and ask the board if there are any specific questions that they have, as well as we can, specifically talk about those parking standards. But let's get maybe some of the questions out of the way, if there are any. Sure, Glenn, go ahead.
I've got about 3 of them.
Sure.
Okay.
Only 3, Glenn? Come on.
They're probably more, don't
That's
Okay,
fine.
I guess I got a concern when I look at low-density residential. You could put 5 residents on a 1-acre lot, correct? That's what, okay, well, my lot is almost an acre. I just can't picture having 5 houses sitting there. I really can't. It concerns me the way we're gonna have the impact on neighbors. If we start putting 5 houses on a 1-acre lot, when people are used to low density, having some elbow room. And it reminds me, and, I grew up here in the city, and I look at the city now, and I'm just shocked at what it looks like with the amount of density that they build into that. And I don't want to see East Bay Township turn into that type of picture, because people out here look at this as a bedroom community. And when you start packing, the potential for packing houses in, I think we're going to lose that.
Can I speak one
Sure.
thing to that? I think that is a good point.
Your show.
I think when you're picturing like single-family detached homes, the way that we have, and ultimately the decision that the Planning Commission made with that minimum lot width of 65 feet, you're going to see that you can't fit you can't put 5 lots on a single acre with the minimums that we have. So we had originally been looking at quite a bit smaller minimums, and the Planning Commission ultimately went with 65 width. So yes, you could potentially, the way this ordinance is written, yes, you could potentially have like a multiplex development that comes in, and so there are, 5 units on that single parcel with a multiplex. But if you're looking at like a single-family detached development, you wouldn't be able to fit 5 lots on there.
But you could get, maybe depending on the width of the acre, you might be able to get 3, 4,
Right.
but, and one of them or 2 of them being duplexes. So what I'm saying is, okay, that's one concern I got. The other thing is, and this wasn't brought up, and maybe it was in the Planning Commission, but I remember here, it's been a couple years ago, it came to the Planning Commission for a storage building with no residents on the property, and the Planning Commission approved it. The Township Board turned it down. Was there any discussion on bringing that back?
We didn't make any changes to that, so our current ordinance does not allow for a residence, does not allow for an accessory building if there's not a principal residence. We do allow for, you can build, if you build 1 year in advance, the pole barn first, or the garage first, and then the residence. If you put like a performance guarantee in, you can have like 1 year to build your home, but we didn't make any changes to that.
To answer that, Glenn, the subcommittee did discuss that at one meeting, fairly long, 30 minutes or so, and I'm for it. Everybody else was against it, just so you know.
Okay,
Didn't you at one time kind of take a look at what other townships did around Grand Traverse County? I recall that there wasn't anybody who allowed a building like that without the principal residence, correct?
There may be. I think there are some rural townships that do allow for that.
Okay.
In certain districts. I know some, would say as long as your parcel is, if you own 2 adjacent parcels, you can have them, which in effect, East Bay would allow that as well if you combine the lots. But, yeah, I do remember looking at other townships. I believe there were some more rural townships that did allow for that.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Don.
the other thing was this temporary dwelling. And I understand what the concept was, if somebody's building a house, they could put a trailer there and stay in it while we're building a house for technically up to a maximum of 2 years. You got a 1 year, and then you can get 2 6-month extensions, if I read it correctly. My personal opinion, I would like to see that taken right out of this. I mean, you're gonna have subdivisions that's got some pretty nice homes in them, and somebody's gonna have a trailer there, and if somebody wants to sell their home, I think it's gonna have a real negative impact if they try to sell it with a trailer sitting there with somebody living in a trailer. I understand why it was put in. I just would ask that really consider taking it even out of this. I think it's gonna end up a problem.
Can I just ask a question, just as I'm listening? If it's in a subdivision, wouldn't it have a homeowners association regulation already? I would think it'd be more, not always. I was gonna think that's more of a meets and bounds type of a situation. But you're correct.
And you're also, the other part of that, when I look at it, if you read on next door to a nice subdivision, and it isn't within the subdivision, you got the same problem. And if people are trying to sell their house, I think it's gonna have a real impact on it.
So Claire, go ahead.
I was just going to comment, that's a concern in the Lakes area as well, and there have been some significant modifications to the ordinance with discussion, but we did have public comment this evening regarding that, so I think we do need to discuss that.
Did you have a comment too, Tracy? Or did I hear Rhonda?
No, it was just Rhonda, but
Oh, okay.
I do have an opinion. I know we've had, and I don't know, Claire hasn't answered if Glenn's interpretation is correct, and I haven't looked at it in the new ordinance, but I would be concerned, we've had several people that their house is burned down or something, and they want to put a camper there so that they can stay there and work on the house or have it built. You know, you can go both ways. That's a hardship on them as well as, you know, somebody wanting to sell their house next door, so.
Yeah, and I know that, oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say, the other side of that coin is we've got campgrounds around where they're set up for a trailer and you're within,
But the cost of renting a campground site
But
is,
you got-
and they don't allow you to stay there for a long period of time.
but
So
the
let-
other concern is, what are you gonna do for septic and
Well, then, let's have Joe and Claire review exactly what the situation would allow under this new zoning ordinance.
So the way that it's drafted right now, it allows for you to camp on the property for a period not to exceed 7 consecutive days and not more than 60 days in a calendar year. Is the way that it's drafted, and that waste and wastewater shall be disposed of properly off-site.
Now, Glenn mentioned the ability to stay for a year.
I think, Glenn, you might have been looking at the temporary uses, so we can give a permit for up to a year, but that would not include a dwelling unit. That would be like a different type of, you know, some sort of a storage building that was not used for a dwelling or habitation.
I guess if somebody wanted a temporary dwelling, that doesn't mean they're gonna, do they have to have the building permit before they can put the temporary dwelling?
The way that this is drafted, no, they wouldn't get any type of
So
permit.
technically, they could go out camping and never have planned on putting a
Right.
dwelling in.
Right.
But I did want to make clear, because you had mentioned it could be a year, and then I thought you said
Two
6
6-month extension.
and that doesn't sound accurate from what I'm hearing.
That is only related to temporary uses, which can't be used for dwelling. So if, say you've got some sort of a storage building while you're constructing your home, you can get a temporary permit to have that. And Joe, correct me if I'm wrong, but you can get a temporary permit to have it for that length of time, and you can have an extension, but none of that allows for living quarters.
So they couldn't live in, if they were going to build a home, they couldn't have some temporary place where they lived in it for up to 2 years while they built. That would not be accurate. They could have a temporary dwelling unit there that would be up to 60 days, but no more than 7 days at a time, is that correct? Okay. All right, so is everyone clear on that? Okay, Glenn, did you have any questions on, did you get the clarification?
Yeah, I'm looking it back up. I probably read from one right into the other.
Trust me, on a 300-page document with a lot of it, that absolutely happens. Now, did we get to all of you mentioned 3 questions. Did we get to the 3 of them?
Well, the only other question I had was that I was wondering how much public comment was put into, I know you guys started back in '22, if I remember. Was there a lot of public comment put into it?
Oh, yeah.
And I'm surprised the place isn't full tonight.
Yeah, and Chairman Gonzalez also allowed for public comment during the meeting, which was nice because they could answer those questions right there.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, other questions or points from board members?
I've got a couple.
Sure.
Looking at the table to some of the updates on page 8, just a couple things. There's a general shift of low, moderate, and high density to increase intensity across all of these zoning districts. I guess I've got a little bit of a concern primarily with the low density, just by virtue of low density, and I know there's a set of definitions in the ordinance that kind of defines that, and I know we've got township goals in the master plan around affordable housing, and there's a lot that has to do with this, but going from under the special land use, right now we allow a duplex, now we're going to go to triplex and quadplexes. That really, in my mind, just as an opinion, does not really fit within the idea of low-density residential. You primarily think of, something relatively low-density, site condos, or single detached homes. So, but this whole, every one of these shifts to much less restrictive, in some cases, we're increasing density by 50% or more. And really, the most increase for the intensity is in the low-density residential. So I guess that's kind of my bigger concern is that low-density residential, those neighborhoods that we traditionally see, based on this, we're going to allow and sort of open the door that a lot of future development is going to be, I'm concerned, will be focused on more of a apartment rental, duplex, quadplex type setup, as opposed to actual neighborhoods that we're going to establish within the township moving forward. Now that that door's open, is there any feedback on that?
Yeah, I would say all good points. A few thoughts that I have, and I open it up to Planning Commission, but much of the low-density residential is developed in kind of single-family detached homes and would not allow for these types of uses, a lot of those established neighborhoods. A lot of the undeveloped portions of low-density, and maybe low-density isn't even the right term, because we have quite a bit of residential development, residential districts outside of the urban growth boundary, the agricultural district, the lakes area, that are also residential, that are actual low-density residential. So I think that these changes are in line with the master plan, in line with even, the previous version of the master plan back in 2015 that was developed. The one thing I would say that I think low-density residential is different than moderate density and high density is that we're not allowing the, apartments there. And so, coming in and putting in, high-density apartments is not something that would be achieved with the way that this is written. I think you're still going to see that it will be predominantly, if it's not single-family detached, it would look more like a single-family neighborhood. Maybe it would be attached townhouses, maybe it would be kind of a mix of some attached units. But I guess the other piece is, rental versus owner-occupied, and that is a challenge because that's not something that we can, regulate or
Sure.
dictate in our zoning ordinance. And, we're seeing that with Brigantine, it's single-family detached homes that are rental. But I would turn it over to planning commissioners if they have other thoughts or comments, just kind of about the process we've gone through.
I was going to, go ahead, Carl.
Oh, I was just saying, I think, when we looked at that, a large part of that discussion and public comment we heard was driven by the affordability of single-family homes. And so how can you have a product that doesn't come in at $425,000, which is unaffordable for a lot of young people? So with a duplex or quadplex, that was one way that people were suggesting maybe we could get a pricing thing where someone could actually afford to buy something.
Mm-hmm.
And the rental costs down as well, without it being a high-rise or a, multi-unit, but, something that would be, reasonable to put on the lot, but also affordable.
That's where I was going to. So there's just been some new presentations in terms of style of what a duplex or a quadplex could look like. And some examples that have been shared with us and the ones that I've worked with every day are they look more like a single-family home.
Sure.
This, as an example, is a quadplex. But you wouldn't know it from any other home that you drove by in northern Michigan, basically. So I think there's a lot of different examples out there that will kind of add some creativity to a neighborhood with allowing kind of a different price point of entry, because these could be kind of minimized, so someone could develop equity in a quarter share of a piece of dirt rather than renting forever. And with that being said too, to Claire's earlier point, I understand that we're increasing the density, no question about it, but they still, if they're gonna go through traditional development patterns with a private road and splitting it up, with doing something like this, the goal too was kind of minimize the impact on the land too. So you're able to squeeze more into a smaller package rather than have to develop the whole thing, which is what we've traditionally been seeing more times than not, which is they just cookie cutter the whole field. Whereas this provides some flexibility, I think, to the development world to say, hey, we can add or we can use a lot more of these units in a smaller footprint.
Yeah. No, I certainly get that. I guess the concern is that, especially on the low-density side, it's sort of, in my mind, should be somewhat protected. And then we get to moderate and high density, and really by virtue of what's laid out here, there's essentially no difference between the two except for a density increase. So everything else pretty much in this table stays the same. The density goes up from high density, but what's allowed, all housing types across both of those. So there's no real discernible difference other than some density. And then we get, again, back to low density, and you're sort of, I don't know, we're losing protection for some of those low-density areas, and just looking at the zoning map, just by land area, 80% of the growth boundary, within the growth boundary is low-density residential. So I guess just as a concern, I'm not saying that I'm necessarily against it, because I know there's a need to support affordable housing, additional options, but I guess I'm worried that we're gonna take what is 80% within that growth boundary and sort of set off what could be a lot of developments focused on rentals. Because what we've seen here lately, at least since I've been sitting on the board, is a lot of proposed developments that are developer-driven rentals. And, right, wrong, or indifferent, everybody's got their opinions on them. I know they have their place and a need, but just looking at what the potential could be under this, we're essentially opening the door to encourage a lot more of that. Do we need it? Probably. In some cases, do we need 80% within that growth boundary to be that potentially? That's another question.
To me, it's not even necessarily like, if I had to draw a line in the sand, I'm kind of with you on the number, like the max density. This is just me. This isn't everybody. I'm with you on the max density calculation. The style of home, to me, is more important. Just to, again, provide kind of a different look.
Yeah.
And an option there, not necessarily the number of units. But going back to Carl's point, we've continually hammered this kind of affordability.
Yep.
And you're right, there isn't a lot of opportunity in our growth boundary area for, any of these other categories to even be implemented. I mean, a lot of it is built out. There are still some opportunities that are pretty low, but you're right, the vast majority of it is low density. So it's kind of a balance of what we've continuously heard, but also trying to keep some character built into it, so.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, I'm good.
Didn't these maximum densities then, weren't they matched to the future land, the future land use, so that they were consistent? Because I remember there was an inconsistency previously between the zoning ordinance and the future land use. So this is something that was the density proposed in that map?
Yeah, I believe so, but, go ahead, Glenn.
Your picture you had there.
Yep.
Of the building. Now, if that's, let's say it's a fourplex, is that considered a single dwelling if it's a rental?
Good question.
It's,
it would be considered a single quadplex, but it would be 4 dwelling units.
But as far as the 5 units per
That
acre,
would be 4.
oh, it will be
Yeah.
even if they're rentals?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And there was that difference in the definitions. Remember Claire was asking you about that today between the dwelling,
A multiplex and attached.
multiple, multiplex, single-family, detached. So individual townhomes or like a duplex are different than a multiplex, which could have upper and lower and kind of mixed together.
The most that is allowed to be attached is 4 units for low-density residential.
Okay.
Yeah, but again, just kind of final comment on this particular topic is, we're sort of in a way doing a, by virtue of potentially approving this, we would be essentially going through a mass rezoning. We've got there's been approvals in the past to take a parcel that may have been zoned, for example, low density. Developer wants to, rezone it to moderate density or high density. There's a lot of public comment and discussion, and a lot of it has to do with some of the density changes associated with the rezoning. With the, in my opinion, the pretty significant shift to intensity across all zoning districts, on the residential side, we're by virtue, kind of going through that township-wide, rezoning the entire township, and I don't know that that's necessarily the way to go about it. It would, I don't know, I have to give it a little bit more thought. On another note, just as a curious point of mine, minimum lot area in square feet for each of the low, medium, and high, just by calculation of 8750, for example, for low density, 8750 square feet times 5, you're 190 square feet. I know it's negligible over what an acre is, but does that present a challenge?
I think there was a desire to make sure that it wasn't smaller. It's so that it was consistent with the master plan.
Okay.
You're right, it would be slightly more than an acre.
Okay. Other comments that I had, and Claire, you and I had, going way back, had some discussions about some of the existing ordinances related to buffers, and it looks like y'all have done, quite a bit to update those. I'm trying to find the page here. Let's see, bear with me one second. Should have bookmarked these. So, buffers, there's a table, a matrix, table 5.7 in the ordinance, looks like it's on page 256. In that table, it defines 3 scenarios, either no buffer required, a minor, or a major, and there's pretty lengthy and detailed definitions of what a minor or a major buffer are. So I've got a couple of questions related to it. The column, the first column on the left, zoning or use of subject site, I'm assuming that would be the proposed, somebody coming to the township to propose to develop a site. And then it's cross-referenced with whatever the adjacent site is. I think this is very useful. However, I don't understand why, for example, if you go down to industrial zoning districts under that first column and cross-reference that with, essentially all other districts, there are buffer requirements. The example that I don't understand is industrial zoning district versus industrial zoning district. There's a minor buffer requirement. However, other applications like single or two-family residential units, multiplex, non-residential uses in residential districts, multifamily, all of those adjacent to an industrial zoning district would not require one. So why would it be, I guess the way that this is sort of set up, it seems to me that it's more set up to prevent complaints or pushback from an existing, owner-occupied or, commercial facility or industrial facility against a new development adjacent to their property versus the other way around. So, if we go into the definitions of the buffer, the landscape buffer, and why we're trying to, protect the environment and add vegetative buffer, why we're not having those scenarios included with a buffer requirement.
Okay, so for.
I know that was a long-winded.
That's okay, but just to make sure that Claire and Joe understand kind of the background of your question, and if they have any feedback, if that's a correct interpretation.
Can we get a clarification? To me, when I was reading the table, we're going down, like the column is the new proposed use, and then going across is the existing. Was that your?
Correct, yep. Yep.
Okay. And I would turn that over to Joe or Andy.
Can I just ask for clarification, because they're not page numbers as much as, let's look at one of the 7 and then what page it'd be on in those different 7.
Yes.
Structures.
Yeah, 546, I'm
I tried
sorry.
that, but I just wanted to make sure that I was in the right place. Thank you.
Thank you, because I was lost.
It's much better when it's an interactive map, and you can actually touch it and have it go to that. We'll get to that one.
Right, so basically, the way the table is set up right now, if you are going to build an industrial use next to a lower intensity use, you have to construct a major buffer. If you're going, let's say you have a property that's adjacent to industrial use and you want to put single-family homes on it, you are not required to install a buffer to protect the industrial use next
Right.
door. You have the option of doing it if you wanted to. Let's say the use is old enough that it doesn't have its major buffer, that it would be required if it was built now. The developer could certainly put a buffer in, but he's not required to do anything in particular if he's got that use next to him.
Well, and that's where kind of I was going with my question is why wouldn't we have that requirement on the residential use, even though it's lower intensity than the existing adjacent use with the industrial facility? It's in my opinion, I mean, it serves the same purpose, right? I mean, it would achieve the same goal to separate intensities of uses. So why wouldn't we have that?
Sure, I mean, it's just generally, most zoning ordinances require the heavier use to construct the buffer and don't require it of the lighter use. I mean, it's just generally, it's kind of a typical arrangement. Doesn't necessarily mean it's the arrangement you have to have, but it is a pretty typical arrangement.
So that was a housing development wouldn't have to put that if they were new going in.
Right, exactly.
According to which then again goes to the cost too, when you're developing those neighborhoods as well, too.
Yeah, I mean, that's fine, but, cost is not really mentioned in the definitions of the buffer. It's really talking about more the protection of the environment and separating aesthetics and, those types of things. So if we want to add cost as part of the definition of a buffer, then we should certainly, put that in there and say, if cost is consideration, then we won't do this. But I just think that, it's, maybe some more thought to that table should be given on how these are dished out. I mean, it's, just by calculation of this table, 30% of these scenarios would not get a buffer. Your example of the industrial use going in adjacent to an existing lower intensity use requiring a buffer, but there's even a buffer required from industrial to industrial.
Right.
They should be equal uses, right? They're not, one's not more intense than the other, they're the same.
Yeah, generally speaking, I think the intent there was to keep the entire thing from being paved over, having some sort of break between them.
Okay.
Okay. Matt, what other questions did you have, or issues?
So, just for clarification, and I'm not an ordinance or a land use expert by any means. Do what?
But wouldn't that be fun, though?
Yeah, no, I don't know. Maybe in another life. The setback requirements, so there's setback standards between different uses. One of the ones I looked at, and just as an example, was 10 feet. 10 feet was kind of a standard throughout this, as far as setbacks go. In the buffer scenario, is the buffer, which I think, I don't remember what the buffer sizes were between minor and major, but are they in addition to the setback, or are they cumulative with each other? Is that did I word that right?
The buffer can occur within the setback, yeah.
Okay.
It's not in addition to the setback. That's
Okay, so if we have what we're calling a green belt or a buffer of 10 feet. 10 feet, within that 10 feet, you're required to plant, by definition, some native species, trees, the tree canopy we talked about quite a bit. White pines, I know, was a big topic in our subcommittee. White pines, as we all know, get very large. Is 10 feet an appropriate, and I'm not an arborist either, but is 10 feet an appropriate space to accommodate a tree canopy associated with, say, a white pine or a maple tree or some of these other native species that we talk about? And that what I see happening is we establish this 10-foot buffer / setback, say, okay, developer or property owner, you put in these native species, we pat each other on the back, and these trees grow up and get big and start scraping against buildings and causing problems, and then we're back to cutting trees down and putting non-native species in that, they might look good and fit within the space, but we're not achieving much in the way of tree canopy or native species. So I don't know if there was any discussions about those.
Was there any thoughts on that with the planning commission? They have to provide a plan, correct?
Yeah, I think part of that is through the site plan review process, is looking at the tree species and the maturity and the size that they take up. I mean, the smaller buffer is 10, the larger one is 20 feet. But I think that is a good point that will need to be taken into consideration when we review plans. I mean, what I was imagining is 10 feet and then green space on either side. But in terms of the amount of green space, we don't have additional requirements for that setback.
Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine again, not a arborist, but I can't imagine too many tree species that could mature within 10 feet without becoming a problem pretty quickly. Yeah, and then I guess the other thing related to, and I'll have to go really dig in and kind of read some more in the way these definitions are laid out. There's buffers and green belts. If we're going to take this seriously moving forward, and we really want to have buffers, whether they be stream buffers or zoning district buffers or intensity of uses buffers, whatever the application is, how is the township going to identify those I know they'll be shown on a site plan in a plan review. Are we going to capture any of that information in GIS and be able to track those and sort of monitor them over time so that there's not, after things are approved, things are built, if there's a native existing green belt that we say, hey, developer says, hey, we're not going to touch this, 5 years pass by, we can go back with satellite imagery and make sure that it's not being encroached on or damaged behind a development that the township really can't access?
We do have really high-quality aerial imagery that's taken every year, and so we do rely on that quite a bit from an enforcement standpoint, just when we're looking at, in the lakes area, vegetation removal, those types of things. Can we see every single tree on there?
Yeah.
Not always, but we have a pretty good idea of what, when vegetation exists. I think right now it goes back to 2014, and it will continue to accumulate over time.
And then, of course, you have the approved site plan that they would have to adhere to.
That's from an enforcement standpoint, something that we go out, we check every landscaping plan after it's been installed to make sure that it's consistent with the approved site plan.
But if you're asking if there's some type of an audit, that's kind of what I'm getting at, is like, is there some type of an annual audit or a 5-year audit on something like that? No, there's not. What there is enforcement, which is like every other municipality across the state, which is complaint-driven or issue-driven. So if something is, say, for example, if there were a development up on US 31 North that had an approved site plan, and it had some vegetation or buffering, and then they changed that, and there was an awareness or it became an issue, that's when we take a look at that and say, okay, is that an ordinance, is that a violation of the site plan? They pull out the site plan, they look on site to see if it is or it isn't, and then they go with enforcement from there, based on what their analysis finds.
Okay.
Other topics?
That's all I've got for tonight.
Okay, how about other township board members? Any others? Okay.
Make a few
Sure.
comments,
Well,
not necessarily questions.
Well, I have a couple, so
Great,
I'm a board
great.
member too, so I think we'll wrap up with the board members and then we'll come back if that's
I
okay.
didn't realize you had comments, my
I do,
apologies.
I know, I forget I don't often forget I have an opinion, do I, guys? Let's see, a couple things. Most of mine, I was looking at the use matrix, which is on page 17 of the ordinance. And first of all, that is extremely useful and helpful. I know that we have that in our current zoning ordinance, but this one is very good. So as an issue, and how the planning commission feels with it and how the township board feels with it, the accessory dwelling unit, I think the accessory dwelling unit was instituted with the planning commission some time ago to provide some flexibility in how we can address housing needs and for our families, right? So ADUs are typically called the granny flats, that type of a thing. And I notice, now while I don't believe planning and zoning gets a lot of requests for accessory dwelling units on an annual basis, probably pretty limited, but yet at least the option still exists there for the flexibility, the affordability, all of those things. And I noticed that it's a use permitted by right in all areas except for the lakes area, natural area, and the Brown Bridge area. So those are also still housing areas, those three, where accessory dwelling units would be useful for families to have those options and flexibility. Now, I understand some of the limitations that we would want to have there as far as proximity to a lake or in environmentally sensitive areas, but there are many areas within this entire, the entire green, beige, and blue area. There are a lot of places there where that type of housing flexibility would be good for families. So I'm wondering with that ADU, if we could not have it maybe as a special land use there with some maybe environmental factors to that, or proximity to lakes, that type of thing. So that may be one issue that I would like for fellow board members and planning commissioners to consider. The other is, and I think Claire and I have talked about this a little bit, you'll notice the adult foster cares, right? So they go from 1 to 6. 7 to 12, 13 to 20, and then you really can skip down to assisted living facility because that's 21 or more. So while there are different definitions, it's kind of like an increasing intensity with the number that are allowed. And if you kind of plot them out in increasing intensity, because these are listed by alphabetically, but you'll notice some inconsistencies where it's like, okay, 1 to 6 and 7 to 12 are allowed, but 13 to 20 aren't, and then 21 is. Or you'll notice some inconsistencies where it goes, it's a use by right, special land use, and then it's a use by right. Why would it be a use by right for more intense and a special land use for less intense? So I think that's maybe some consistency I think that you would want to take a look at maybe administratively and with Giffords Webster and just kind of shore that up and make sure it makes sense as they, as the increasing intensity goes. Let's see, as well, bed and breakfast. We have bed and breakfast. I think we've got 3 or fewer and 4 or more. And I guess under the natural area in Brown Bridge, I would have the same question on why those might not be a special land use in those areas. They're not allowed there. And then in LDR, it's a permitted by right for 3 or fewer, and it's left just completely out for 4 or more, while it's consistent among the other MDR, HDR, rural, and ag. Let's see. Financial institutions are left out of industrial, and I would note, I would think financial institutions are also like wealth advisors, right? They have offices. So we've had Peterson McGregor that's been back in the industrial area, so they're kind of left out of the industrial, maybe as a special land use, that might be appropriate, but if there's daycare and eye care back there, I wonder if there wouldn't be a place for the financial institutions there. With respect to hotels and motels, and I actually, on that one, I'm going to skip out of the land use and go to that section. With hotels and motels, I wonder if we have any ability, one of the things that we've heard through the master plan, through the, doing the zoning ordinance, and the beach district, is we've heard a lot of people frustrated with number of hotels up there. Oh, another hotel. Oh, another hotel. And in trying to make that beach district more community-oriented, where it's for residents and tourists alike, I wonder if we could not have a criteria for hotels and motels that are in that regional business district, that they would have some place of public space within them when they are developed. So, yeah, it might be another hotel, but if it has an internal restaurant that the public can go to, if it has, like we've seen in others, the rooftop bar, or maybe, I remember one at one time that's not going in right now, had a Starbucks in it or something, so that it's also a third space for the public and residents. So while we might, yes, have another hotel come to us on one of those on one of those parcels, it actually has a purpose and a drive for residents as well, not just tourists. So that would be one thing I would ask the board and the planning commission to consider with hotels and motels. Recreational facility outdoor. I see that we have it as a special land use in pretty much all the residential areas except for the lakes area, natural area, and Brown Bridge. This one kind of interests me because when you look at recreation and being outdoors, there's no place better to be outdoors than in this entire half of the township for recreation, and yet none of that is allowed there. Again, I understand, you don't want to commercialize it much there, but you have PGOs there, right? And they are a little zoning district in and of themselves there. Without allowing anything else, you've just allowed one place to exist. They're going to do really well for the next 10 or 20 years, so the new owners made a really good purchase, right? I'm just wondering if there isn't the ability to do a special land use there where we guard against it being too commercialized in that area, but you have allowed some recreational out in the outside where there's a tremendous amount of recreation to be enjoyed. Let's see. Outdoor storage. One of the things we have on outdoor storage under personal, first of all, I think outdoor storage is only allowed in, it is a use by right in ag, LA, NA, and BR. So no outdoor storage in rural, low, media, or high density. And it's a use by right in the others. And the way that it's defined is it's exterior storage of not more than any combination of 4 boats, trailers, campers, motorhomes, jet skis, snowmobiles, other recreational vehicles, whether owned by the property owner or by others. So one, I wonder, when we have a vast amount of LDR, can the person not store one recreational vehicle outside? We live in northern Michigan. People have a snowmobile or a boat. I can understand why we might not want 4. And then the other part is where it says, even in the parts where it is allowed use by right, it says whether owned by the property owners or by others. We know that that is something that we do have an issue up here with, is people storing other people's recreational vehicles on their property for really commercial purposes. And so I wonder if we would want to take a look at that definition, that it is just the parcel owner who can store that, so that we're not really getting into any commercialization of outdoor storage. We had some DPW verbiage in here with REUs, and I talked with Claire about just maybe changing that terminology so that it's adaptive to anything the DPW does, that it's not specifically the REUs, it's just, listen, as long as they're compliant with the DPW and the township standards through the DPW, then it's good to go. That way, if that ever is changed, we wouldn't have to worry about changing the zoning ordinance.
What page are you on there with that GPW?
With that one, it was 4-4. Or maybe it was 4.4. Okay. You find it, Glenn? No?
I got 4.4 is adult foster care.
It,
One starts with accessory dwelling unit.
and it says detached accessory dwelling units and those attached dwelling units which function as a separate habitable unit shall have the required number of residential equivalent unit benefits and purchase any additional REU benefits as needed when served by the Department of Public Works. And I think they can just create a more general language so that we don't ever have to remember that we'd have to go back and change this if they changed their verbiage of their standards. And then the last part I have is cell towers. Cell towers is a little bit lengthy, and by gosh darn, it's probably the most boring segment in here. But obviously, as you know, we have cell towers on water property through the township. Township is exempt from the zoning ordinance. We know that, and it's stated in here a couple places. But yet, under cell towers, we have the township under the zoning ordinance, which is inconsistent. So I think if that's one thing I would like to definitely have the board or the planning commission allow staff to do, maybe is to go back and take a look at that and make that verbiage more consistent with the legalities of the township not having to function under that part of the zoning ordinance. As we know, individuals can have cell towers too. And so I think that is what's really, that's what that section is meant for, not for the township portion. And that probably was related not to language that we've had here. It might have existed before and just was there and never really caught. Because I think pretty much everything came out of either the previous language from the other zoning ordinance or from best practices that Giffords-Webster's has come through, or like the list of changes that Claire had, planning commission suggestions, and then of course public comment. And so all of those have created those changes, but there are some things that have, continued on through. So there's some of the language that we could take a look at with the cell towers. So.
We got into great debate about
Cell towers, like I said, most boring part, right? Yeah.
But it's not.
It's pretty boring internally here in the office too, when we have to deal with them, but So those are a couple of things. We can, double back and get some consensus related to those, but if we've all kind of gotten a chance to, from the board's perspective, kind of state what our questions are. And Rhonda, you had some additional comments.
Yes, some just additional comments. So Matt, you were talking about the potential of maybe an audit when we were talking about buffer and what's being done. And so one of my questions, or comments, is that Claire has led us, along with Giffords and Webster, to this amazing rewrite of these zoning ordinances. And your team has grown exponentially, and we appreciate that. And you've got a lot of work ahead because we've got a lot of growth in East Bay Township. But I'd like to tie that to a comment that Brendan made, do we have the will to enforce the ordinance? And so, yes, we know we're complaint-based, issue-based, and that's a standard across multiple townships. But is there an opportunity for some additional administration with respect to, this new ordinance to ensure that everything is in compliance? And I know Claire and her team can't be everywhere all the time. They're really good at, reviewing issues and complaints, typically within 24 hours, and that's phenomenal, absolutely. But I just wonder, do we have the will to enforce the ordinance? It was
Sure.
a comment, made by Brendan, and that kind of ties into.
Sure, and I can speak a little bit about that and then see if Claire has some follow-up comment about that. But, well, first of all, as you know, this is a zoning ordinance that would be implemented. So as it's a zoning ordinance, it is very different than a general law or a police power ordinance. With those, everybody must comply immediately. This is a zoning ordinance. They don't have to. What existed, and you move forward, and that's why you have a whole section on nonconformance. So that's one thing that it's important everybody understand about implementing a new zoning ordinance and having new ones. So if they find something that was allowed today, and it exists today, this is passed, and it doesn't allow it, that doesn't mean we can take an ordinance enforcement on that issue. That would be lawful nonconforming. With respect to ordinance enforcement, Rhonda's right. We do, just like every other municipality, which is complaint-based. And, or if an issue is presented to us, or we notice an issue, obviously, but it's generally complaint-based. Whenever we receive those, and Claire and her team log those in and have a running tally of those, they will take a look at that ordinance complaint. Now, an ordinance complaint does not mean an ordinance violation. And so they will look at it and say, okay, what are they thinking that it violates, right? Because not everybody says it violates section 2.21 of whatever. So they'll look at it and say, what are they thinking it violates? They will investigate it, whether that means they go on site, they talk to the person, whatever. Typically, I would say generally it means they go on site, but not always. And they will determine if it is a violation or not. If it is not a violation, well, then it's not a violation. They log it in as it's not a violation and they move on. That is a common occurrence because not everybody understands the ordinance or the application of the ordinance and the legal ramifications behind it. So we commonly find that. And we will let the person know who made the complaint if they leave their information with us. We will let them know, okay, you thought it was, a complaint on this part of the ordinance. It's actually not. Here's what's happening and here's what's going on, so it's not a complaint. If they don't leave their name and number with us, or we don't know where that came from, and that does happen, then we obviously can't let them know, but we've determined it's not a ordinance violation and we move on. If there is an ordinance violation, we will be in touch with that property owner, the person, let them know what the violation is, and that they need to come into compliance. Coming into compliance, this is another kind of preconceived notion that people have, is ordinance enforcement is a ticket. That's really not where you want to be, actually. Or ordinance violation is a ticket and then taking them to the magistrate or to the district judge. That's not where you want to be. Ordinance violation is bringing people into compliance. And so if there is an ordinance violation, we will alert that property owner and ask them and explain to them how they're violating the ordinance and ask them how they will come into compliance. And then we will monitor that for them to come into compliance. So, and we track those things additionally. Now, if you have an egregious person who is just like, I'm violating your ordinance and I don't really care because your ordinance is your ordinance and I just don't feel like it applies to me. And they're just being egregious about it, not going to come into compliance. That is maybe when a time when you get into ticketing. There is also with how a person comes into compliance and in what time they come into compliance, there is also the ability to, the township and its staff has the ability to, I'm trying to think of the right word our attorney would use, but we have deference with the application of that ordinance. And when I say that, do not interpret that as unequal treatment. That is not it. What it is it going to take them a week to clean that up? Is it going to take them 4 weeks to clean that up? What's reasonable? Okay, that's where we have some deference, okay? The person just had, their spouse just went through a major medical issue. They're not going to be able to clean that up within 7 days. It's just not going to happen. If we give them 6 weeks, we'll be back out to the property and you've had some family help you and we think that that's good to go. So that's where you want to bring them into compliance. And then when you have to, you guys all know of the kind of very visible source that we had when we had the Fiegel's blight issue over on Supply Road. That was an egregious time when we not only ticketed, went to court, he went to jail, so those things are options, but they are options that you do want to stay away from, because not only one is, you have to make sure that you are giving the person do right, or whatever rights they have under the law, and not to hinder those, plus it is very expensive. It is very expensive and a tremendous amount of time and resources. So we do, again, when we get those complaints in, and we do ask for them, ordinance violations, suspected ordinance violations, we do ask them to be logged in on the township website. There's an area to do that. And we ask those to be logged in rather than just someone calling and saying, hey Beth, hey Claire, hey Bill, because that doesn't get tracked as easily. And so if they can log those in, then we can make sure that they're being tracked. Now, if someone says something, does that mean that they have to, like if someone says, I don't have access to a computer, but I do want to let you know I think this is an ordinance violation. Well, of course, we're going to address that. We're not going to say, well, just because you can don't log it in, but we're probably going to go log it in. So that's how we address ordinance violations. I can tell you that the log that we have, all of those violations, or as they track them, they take a look at all of those. The other thing is there is a very real cost to some of these policy decisions we're making, right? So something that may be considered for a general law or a zoning ordinance, they have specific costs for enforcement. So yes, could we, give me a potential ordinance that would be a tremendous amount of enforcement? Well, let's do the grass, right? That one came to it, sorry, I asked you for a suggestion, and I'm like, no, that doesn't work, let's do a different one.
Feels like I'm at home.
Well, you guys all remember we had the noxious weed in front of us. And the problem with the noxious weed is, and I don't even remember if it was a divided vote or unanimous, I have no idea, you guys. But the point is, the pros and cons of it are, the pros are, well, it'd be surely nice if everyone kind of took care of their property and kept the grass, when they want the grass done and all of those things. But the con of that is, Claire, don't go too far though, but whatever you need to do, but don't go too far. Because I'm wrapping up. But with that noxious weed ordinance, the other part is that you have to have the resources to do that. So while it sounds good and you put that forward, what people need to understand is that policy decision has a very real cost to it. We operate the township on about 0.63, 0.68 mils. And as a matter of fact, our new township assessor came to me today because they did board of review and had some things like on the tax roll, some things off the tax roll, and we were talking about the impact, and he's like, he kept saying what the impact was. I go, I don't think it's going to be that high. I think it's going to be much lower. And he's like, no, I put it through. What are you at, six mils? I'm like, no, because he's from a city downstate. I'm like, 6 mils? He said, I thought you already did a manipulation of it. I'm like, no, 0.6. He goes, are you serious? And he's like, we run this on 0.6? I'm like, yeah, we do. And so there's a very real cost to that. So that's absolutely fine if we, want to do a noxious weed ordinance. But then what we need to know is we need someone who's going to enforce the noxious weed ordinance. And they have benefits, and they have retirement, and they have costs, and they have salary, and all of those things. So that's not to say we don't enforce. We do, but we keep it in scale, obviously with what our resources are, what the community desires, and carry it out from there. Claire, that was really a long explanation.
No, I appreciate the explanation. I was just asking a question.
Yeah.
Based
Did
on
you
the comment.
did you have any further comments on that?
Well, I would just say that throughout this ordinance update, that has been a topic that's been at the forefront of our discussion is how will this be enforced? So kind of looking at changes. One example, when we're looking at the vegetative buffer, right now we say the first 30 feet, you have to retain 80% of the native vegetation, and then the next 20 feet, you retain 50% of the native vegetation. Then we get complaints in, well, they remove more than 50% of the native vegetation between 30 feet. That's an example of something that we couldn't enforce. Like, we didn't have the capability to do that, geospatial analysis on every single property and look back in time. And so that's one example where we said, there's, basically, you can have X, Y, and Z within your vegetative buffer. You can have your walkway, you can have your viewing platform, you can have your dock. Beyond that, there's no vegetation removal. So that's one example of kind of some of the policy discussions that we're having to say, how can we enforce the ordinance in a way that is not, beyond the scope of our, takes a tremendous amount of time to, figure out how many trees. And similar to like our short-term rental ordinance, a lot of the policy discussion is around how do we enforce it? Can we enforce every single element, with the temporary dwellings? What if someone stays there 8 nights? sure, we're not going to be able to monitor that, but that at least gives us a benchmark to go out and say, hey, you've been there 2 weeks, and that's not permitted in the ordinance.
There's another element to enforcement of an ordinance as well, which occurs more at the front end, which is when a planning commission or staff or zoning board of appeals or the township board is looking at a plan that comes in, it's applying the ordinance, as intended, so that right up front, you've got the ordinance guiding how you're permitting things. And then if there's something that's out of line with that, it's also going to be out of line with the plan. So you've got kind of two avenues of enforcement there.
That's a good point, thank you.
Very good point. Yep. Sure.
This is a whole changing gears. Is there anywhere in here talking about biosolids, or are biosolids in some other ordinance?
I heard there was a discussion about biosolids, and it is not in this ordinance.
Would it be an ordinance, would it be a zoning issue?
That's a good question. I don't know if Grand Traverse County has something, and Bill had mentioned that to me, and we were going to look into that, but it's not something that we're addressing right now in this ordinance.
Well, it's a real issue because there is a neighbor of mine that is seriously looking to do it. And
It's a state permit.
it is, it's state and federal. But my question is, biosolids are supposed to be just that, coming from a treatment plant that's already been treated. This is supposed to be coming from the Coast Guard station, and I don't know if they have the proper treatment plant to do it. For those that don't know, biosolids is the ground application of human waste. So, I don't think anybody in this room really would like to see it happen. But I think that's where the powers to be, that maybe that it really needs to be inspected, because he's pushing to have it done, so. And if it's state and federal and we can't do anything, that's one thing, but if we could write something that might be able to regulate it somehow, I think it needs to be considered.
So it's supposed to be regulated by the EPA, right?
Well, it's state and federal, so, yeah. A lot of it falls under, so a lot of it falls, I think, under GAMP some too, but and that's not, there's a big difference between.
Yeah, we'll check with MSU Extension and get some information on that.
I just wanted to make sure everybody's aware.
Also check with the DPW as well, too. Yeah. Okay, other topics?
I've got one other comment here. Going to, I'm going to use the right numbering system, 5-14, page on EV charging stations. I think it would probably be good, item number 4, to get a little more specific about the definition around charging infrastructure. And I was trying to work out in my head what would be the scenario that would require over 4 units times, I think a requirement for a quadplex, for example, would require 0.75 parking spaces per unit, multiplied by 15%, you get half of a parking spot, so is 0.45%. So would that trigger a requirement? Maybe it needs to be more defined on a, I don't know, an exact number of parking spaces possibly, but also, more importantly, I guess, maybe a little more meat around the charging infrastructure as opposed to just a conduit that, in my mind, probably presents future challenges if someone wants to actually install a charger, if there's not the electrical infrastructure in the building to accommodate the additional load. Some of these chargers are, 80, 100, 200 amps potentially, so if they haven't, in the design of the facility, if they have not accommodated that within the service provided by the electric utility or or in their breakers that are available, then it's going to present challenges, and it probably never will get done, so.
Anytime there's a partial parking space, we round up, so.
Well, that one would, at .45, I guess, would round down, yeah.
No, we would always round.
Oh, okay, I got you, any partial.
But yeah, that's a good point. We could see if that's building code or if that's something that we could take a look at for the electrical requirements.
So circling back to some of these issues, from the township board's perspective, is there a consensus or a will to ask the planning commission to look at the LDR requirements as far as density and some of the issues that Matt and Glenn were bringing up? I mean, I think you have good points, and those are things I've struggled with too personally, but I think that also, I think that Carl and Dan brought up some excellent points, and when I weigh those, and then I look to what Claire and the our zoning consultants have drafted, I really kind of lean towards moving in that direction, especially based upon Yarrow's review of what we were doing and kind of how those align with best practices. So, I don't know, Matt, I see you,
Well, when we discussed it at the subcommittee level, we discussed it seems to me, over 2 different meetings, but at least. And the big discussion, Carl was right, is that it was about, my point is that you need to look at what future housing is going to be. There's a lot of talk about the American dream being dead and how you can't afford to build a house and so forth. Well, part of that is that we can't require people to build 1,800 square feet anymore. So if we can create more density and allow them to build smaller housing, it is, and my question to everybody is, you really got to understand what is housing. I mean, housing is just a unit for someone to live in, to whatever. And we get tied up in the weeds sometimes with the architectural part of it and not just the function of making sure it's safe and secure. And so I really do feel that what was presented and then finally come up with is the way to go, that we need to be allowed to allow for more types of housing to solve, as some say, it's a housing crisis. If we don't do it, we're going to end up with what I've said for years too, is that some of you call it the urban growth boundary. I've called it for years, this is the anti-growth boundary. And if you look at it, where's the growth been? Outside of the growth boundary for most parts. Why? Because we are pretty restrictive on what used to be allowed inside that growth boundary. I've talked about, I think it really needs to be adjusted myself, but that's another story. Because you're right, there's a large area that's labeled LDR that is really more rural than it is LDR, and that eventually it's going to be built. The growth boundary was established originally back in the 90s. And its sole purpose back then was to try to expand the sewer and water system. And then over the years, it's morphed into more of there's something else. And, but I really feel strongly that I don't think we want to mess with what we've come up with, because it's finally something that's going to hopefully encourage more houses and more housing to happen. We just can't say no all the time. We have to be allowed, have some guidelines for people to follow. So that's my point.
Thank you. Mindy, Tracy, or Sue, I don't want to put you on the spot. Feel free to say nothing, but if you want to, talk about it all, your preference on the LDR, you're welcome to.
I guess I'll just echo some of what Matt has said, but I think to be proactive instead of reactive is going to allow us to make the designs of the township. If we're always having a developer come to us and ask us for an exception, are we purposefully enhancing where we all live? If we are more purposeful and look at these changes, which I'm also in agreement with, then we are back in the driver's seat saying, this is what this will do, this is what this looks like, and we're not having developers come to us for exceptions, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does, it does. Okay, unless you have anything else, I think we'll go with where we are with LDR right now. Does that feedback help the planning commission, do you think, Dan?
Yeah, if you're comfortable with it, we've kicked the tires on it.
Okay.
We've heard it a few times.
Okay, all right. The hotels, the issue about the hotels, about having some public amenity to future hotels. Any interest in taking that up?
We typically ask that when they do come to us, is there a rooftop or public amenity? And it's usually either space-driven or parking-driven, which then goes back to the parking where we've kind of relaxed it to the point where we kind of leave it up to the developer to tell us what they're going to need. So we drop it down low with that, putting some trust in the developer saying, we know what we need, or we've been in the hotel business, we know whether that's based on rooms or not, what they need. So
Yeah.
it's one of those, it's like we're trying to work with them on a case-by-case basis, but also relax it enough to, reduce the parking, but also, be a little bit easy going, I guess.
Sure.
To that point, I don't know that it's something that we took on directly with the additional use. I like the idea. When you said it, it makes sense. I think we may have been fortunate because we've had so many of them recently, and so many of them have tried to incorporate something into that. But you're right. Right now, we don't require it.
Maybe we just leave that for an amendment.
That's possible.
Sue?
Just ask for clarification, I may be remembering it wrong, but when Alexandria came to us initially, their rooftop deck was just going to be for their patrons staying there, but now it's open to the public. I mean, I think that's a bonus, that's a positive end to what it started to be.
Well, that's because we changed the parking standard.
I figured there. Thank you.
So maybe that's something that we leave out of this zoning ordinance, but maybe it's something that you guys take a look at in the future, which is basically, us as a community telling the developer what we need to have out of that space in order for what the community is telling us, so.
Well, and I had a conversation with someone who was in the office, came in for, I don't know, voting taxes, something. And she wanted to know why we didn't limit the number, tell them they can't build hotels down there. I'm like, we can't really tell them they can't, but I think an idea of an accessory use or a public use would be helpful. We've talked we talk all the time about wanting a restaurant or more restaurants on this end of town, and I think that would help. I think the public amenity would help. I don't know if we can necessarily make it a requirement, because it is dollar-driven, and space is money, and so but I like the idea of it.
Okay.
There's some creative method that somebody can come up with.
Well, we'll leave that up to you guys for a future, like I said, a potential ordinance
And
amendment.
maybe that's something that we look at as a part of the beach district's development in terms of like an incentive,
Yeah.
if you will. If you provide X, Y, and Z, you may get X, Y, and Z to make it worth your while.
Okay.
And yeah, that might be a way to look at it.
Let me move on to cell towers. Are you guys fine with them looking at this administratively and making any corrections so that's aligned properly?
Yeah.
Okay. Does that work out for you, Claire and Joe?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Let's see. We mentioned that we'll take a look at biosolids as well. They'll do some research into that. Again, maybe something after this zoning ordinance, but on the radar for staff to take a look at. The ADUs in more areas in those other 3 districts where they're left out. Is there an interest in that with the township board?
I'm fine with that as long as we can equate that to the septic issues, especially around the lakes area.
How does
Okay.
that play into the fact that you're going to require 2 acres now? If they add a structure, then would they have to have 2 acres to do that?
No, not the way that the ADU ordinances provisions are written. So one thing we could look at is only allowing ADUs in those districts if they're outside of an environmentally sensitive area. That would keep them outside of, off the lakes, off the Boardman River. But we could still allow, I believe, and I can double check the ADU ordinance, but it doesn't need to be a legal conforming lot, so it doesn't need to meet the lot size requirements.
But I agree with you. The lakes area is the tough part because they are small lots and everything else, and then, but the ag district really isn't there. I mean, why would they be any different than anybody else?
And there's even some larger lots in that, in those other zoning districts.
Right.
That, as long as they're not in the environmentally, okay. So we'll ask the planning commission to take a look at adding the ADUs in those residential areas with some environmentally sensitive criteria. Okay. Checking off the list here. Parking. Mindy mentioned parking. What is the thoughts from the township board regarding parking?
My question, I think I asked it once before too, isn't there a kind of an accepted standard or, some kind of guideline written on parking for hotels and restaurants?
There,
Well, I can see, okay.
There are maybe standards that you'll see in a lot of ordinances. I don't know that I would go so far as to call anything when it comes to parking an accepted standard. Back when zoning ordinances were first introduced, people took a stab at roughly how much parking should be required for various uses, and most of those are still in place to some degree. A lot of them have never been changed in some communities, and they mostly amounted to, educated guesses. The Institute of Traffic Engineers does publish parking generation manuals, and they do provide estimated quantities of parking for uses. However, they don't really cover all of the different contexts in which that use might be permitted. So they kind of, it's really suburbia, like the kind of suburbia you have in the second ring of suburbs around Detroit that most of their studies are done in. So they might not really map perfectly here or in a lot of other communities. So there's really not much consensus on how much parking to require for most uses. But most proprietors have a sense of how much is going to be needed on their, for their particular use based on their experience with other locations. And I think that's kind of the ground that we were aiming for here was to have a floor and a ceiling and let people kind of tell us where they need to be within that range.
And I like that approach. I mean, because you're involving the individual, giving them some leeway.
Right.
You know, but, you know, we don't want a situation where they got 50 parking lots and they got 75 cars to park.
Sure,
So, because then you're in the other direction, so.
They don't want that situation either.
No, that's what I'm saying.
We had a ton of discussion on this, and it was set it low, knowing that they're probably gonna come in, like, knowing what they're gonna need for the most part, and then go from there. Because again, we also don't want, you have 75 spots, but you're only using 35 of them, you know?
Do you remember the hotel that Werfel's put in that's next to the German-looking building?
The Baywatch?
Yeah,
Is that what it's called? I mean, that has
a lot of parking.
way too much parking, and it's kind of sad in that, I mean, there's no sense in it. But yet I understand what you're getting at, because when you curb it down too much, then we have issues. And then we have even potentially safety issues, you know, so.
Well, I'm concerned more about those units that are quarter ownership or whatever ownership they are, but there's multiple owners in a unit, and the way that each person uses that unit is probably very different, right? And some of those units have 2 and 3 bedrooms, and we've got a potential problem going on down there, and
Yeah, but 2 and 3 of those bedrooms are really like having, you go to a hotel and you get a connected room, I mean.
right, but our ordinance is saying that you need 1.5 if you have 3 connected rooms, but it's only saying you need a half of one for that unit. So the unit size is not included in our ordinance right now, and that's.
You can have 6 adults come into that 3-bedroom unit, and they could be driving 5 cars.
That one came down to the condo docs and them abusing that,
Well,
and then
I-
now
I-
they're finally enforcing it, and
Right.
you got some mad people.
I agree with that, but some of these hotels also have 2 and 3 bedroom units in them coming in, and we don't address multiple bedrooms at all. We only look at that unit, and that's my only concern. It's not all the, regular hotel rooms, it's those bigger ones. I just want to make sure that.
I mean, I wonder if they would be better defined as multifamily as opposed to hotel. And if that was something that was reviewed maybe today, we would have defined them as multifamily. Right now, our multifamily
sure.
still is pretty flexible. And so I think the lower end is 0.75 parking spaces up to like 1.25 or something, or 1.5.
And you could also, if you've got hotels with suites with multiple bedrooms, you could change the verbiage to something along the lines of per guest room or per bedroom within a suite or something like that.
That's exactly what I'm saying, is it's not, we miss those bigger units, and I don't think it's a large share, and I don't think that it's gonna change the majority of what's coming through the door, but I think we need to pay attention to if we do have, I'll call it a penthouse suite, right? With multiple bedrooms and could be, it's not a half a parking space type.
Sure, Glenn, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to suggest that. I think the city went through all this just recently, and we might talk to them. They've cut it way down from what they required, because and I can't quote exactly what they said, but something about the fact that the developer is going to determine how many parking spots they need. So the city's kind of backing out and letting the developer decide what they need. And I don't know how that's going to work, but just pass that along.
Yeah, that's what, Sue? Yeah, that's kind of where they're at. What's that, Sue?
Just a couple comments on that. I believe some of these destination hotels probably have no drivers. They probably are chauffeured in, or they take a taxi or something, they don't have a vehicle, they use the Bayliner to be able to go to town. And I'm agreeing, I'm just trying to look at another perspective on it. So you might have one lodging group have 3 vehicles, and 2 lodging groups have none, and it may work out better, I don't know. This is just another thought as we're having the discussion. A lot of people still drive large, wide vehicles, and I've seen many parking lots striped for small, narrow vehicles. Is that part of the standards that this is to be looked at? Because not everything's coming in as a Mini Cooper, but it seems like a lot of the spaces are designed for that.
I don't know, I can fit that F-250 wherever I want to.
I'd like to have a Mini Cooper to do that with, but I also see some Yukons and some other things of that nature to try to fit into those spaces. It's causing some issues.
Yeah.
A lot of that depends on the governing or township. I know the city requirements are smaller than the standard. You know, the standard is a 9 by 20, you can fit a normal vehicle in that. You go downtown, it's 8 by 16.
Thank you, that's.
I think are we keeping 9 by 20? Yeah, so it's currently 9 by 20, and we're keepking it at 9 by 20.
And then, of course, it requires them to park correctly in the spot, which nobody seems to do.
Don't worry, you'll end up on Overheard in Traverse City. So does that give you some direction working with parking?
Can I just make one?
Yes, of
comment
course.
on parking? If anything, are we doing about those guests that come that bring their recreational vehicles with them? Their boats, their snowmobiles, their jet skis? Because that's not included in, I don't think it's included in our parking standards.
I think it's just a problem that needs to be figured out
By the owner.
Well, just,
Yeah.
I mean, some of them, have an off-site parking that they'll do, some don't. They just tell them to park on the outer edge and park up on the grass and, but then I saw just this last weekend, I went by and there's several boats sitting in parking lots or parking spots without the vehicle because you can't, if you're using a spot, you can't park a vehicle with it. So they're using 2 spots for one room instead of half a spot. And so I'm just,
Yeah, no, I think
That's
that's a
something.
good question. I think it would come down to, if people if they're parking, it's a violation if you're parking on the grass, if you're parking in the fire lane, those types of things. If they're parking them in the parking spaces, I think it's kind of a management
right,
issue.
but I just didn't know if that,
Yeah, wasn't part of the conversation.
because I don't think a developer wants to have that conversation when they're applying, so.
I think what we're generally saying, Mindy and Dan, is we feel your pain with the parking. We're not entirely sure what the issue is. We don't want to see those huge lots that are underutilized, but we hate to see those, people trying to fit a ton of spaces into nothing that creates an issue. So, whatever you guys need to do to figure that out, we would be supportive of, basically. Not offering any solutions, right. But we understand that. Buffers, any concerns related to the buffers that we want to see updated or addressed?
I know that when I was on the planning commission, we always talked about, there needed to be a buffer between this use and that use or the next. And, we always went to arborvitae because they're tall and skinny and they create a great buffer. They don't last very long.
The deer eat 'em.
Well, yeah, exactly. So I get what you're saying, because my maple trees would not sit in a 10-foot swath of, setback. I think there are things that, as Claire said, on the landscaping plan, that they can address that at the time. So I'm not sure that there's a lot else that needs to be done to it.
Yeah.
It's not like we can put a 20-foot setback, because that shrinks your building envelope a great deal.
Yeah, I kind of think it has more to do with the site plan review.
The landscape
Okay.
plans and.
I'm seeing some head nods with that, so I think that's where we'll go with that. Outdoor storage, any concerns about it being owner or anyone, the four vehicles?
What?
So the outdoor storage for RVs, campers, snowmobiles, everything that has four or less being owner or other owned, it doesn't specify. Any thoughts with that? It's also not allowed anywhere in, right,
I think if you're gonna have outside storage in the residential area, it should be the owners, not
Yeah.
owners or somebody else's.
Yeah, I would agree.
Because what happens is, the owner starts running that spot. That's what I foresee happening.
We've seen it a lot. Yeah.
We've already limited it to just 4. So whether I own the 4 or me and my brother owns 2, I mean, I guess, I've always been kind of more of a personal rights thing, and that's why I just kind of, we're not going to end up with what we used to have, I think, over here on the Hammond Road, where you had all those boats and campers and things stored, because we're limiting it to 4. And we're limiting it to fairly small things. I don't think you're going to see 4 big motorhomes being parked there. People don't have that kind of lot to do it. So, personally, I think what's written there has got enough regulation to regulate it to a point where I don't think you're going to see a big problem.
Okay. I'm fine with that as well, although I will say, we don't have any allowed in, I know it's LDR, but it's,
Low-density residential.
low-density residential. Do we in rural?
No.
RR?
No.
So I'm seeing that's an issue, because what's going to happen then is, this is passed and people are going to call and be like, this is on 4 Mile Road, this is on 5 Mile Road, they have a camper out. And that's a lot of, we have a lot of people who have campers, a boat, this or that. So I think if we're going to say anything about the outdoor storage, then we should probably have something in those. Yeah, and in some of those districts, 4 is going to be way too much.
We have 10 acres. 4 on our property, we don't have it, but 4 on our property would not have as large a footprint or impact as someone that's got an acre.
Exactly. So why don't we just leave it at this, and we won't come up with the solution, we'll just give you back the problem and say we really feel like outdoor storage should maybe be something that you guys want to take a look at with the zoning ordinance. Recreational facility outdoor, not in the areas where a lot of that recreation is. Any thoughts on that from the township board?
Give me an idea what you're looking at for outdoor recreation, wedding reception?
No. Claire, are we talking, like, what are we talking with that? Snowmobile rental or?
Really some sort of a commercial outdoor activity, whether it's,
So zip lines or frisbee golf.
You think of Mount Holiday.
And that wouldn't be in a residential area, or is that what you're asking for?
It's right now, recreational facility outdoor is the special land use in ag all the way over to manufactured housing. So it's in those first 6 columns. This is in your zoning ordinance.
The definition specifies some things that would be examples. I just give them to you so that, to inform the conversation. It would include commercial playgrounds, ski lifts, archery targets, mini golf, disc golf, ice skating, extreme sports equipment and facilities, water parks, and other similar outdoor facilities. That's what's listed in the definition.
So all those are listed in the definition, but it is by special land use, by the review by the planning commission, so they would have some criteria and discretion with that. And the point I was asking is, do we want to allow the same special land use in LA, NA, and BR?
To me, that would make some sense to be more consistent, so that the areas that we have those broad spaces, there could be recreation.
Okay, any other thoughts on that?
That's fine to have the planning commission look at it and work out more detail for that.
Okay, are you guys fine with that? Okay, there you go. Outdoor facility, outdoor storage. Yeah.
My tab is running.
Yeah. And if I'm missing any, please let me know, but I think I've covered them.
Adult foster care.
Adult foster care. So with adult foster care, this is so bad, I'm not even going to show you these notes, but I'm going to kind of show you. I put out that table and listed it instead of alphabetical, 1 to 6, 7 to 12, 13 to 20, and 21 plus. And you can see there are some spots here that just don't make sense. It's like, okay, when you're growing in intensity, you're use by right, special land use by right, use by right. That doesn't make any sense. It must go up, right? So I'd like for, administratively, for them to correct that and bring that back in the next addition to you guys. But what the one policy decision is, where does that become use by right? Now it's a special land use. At what level? Is that 1 to 6, 7 to 12, 18 to 20, or 21 plus?
I wonder if it's a change in state permit.
Yeah.
Some of them have to be permitted by right under state law, yeah, so obviously.
Or up to 6.
So they can
Up to
take a look
6,
at
yeah, because that's what you've got in there now. So do we start the special land use with the last 3 categories? Or do you want to go to the 13 and 20 or the 21 plus?
I think they could look at it and look at the state requirements.
Okay.
Kind of like what they're doing with daycare.
Okay. And again, I would ask that they look at what's the consistency across the zoning districts as well. Are you guys fine with that? Okay, I'm seeing some nodding heads, 3, 4, 5, 6, okay. All right. Is that clear as mud for you, Claire? Okay. All right, anything else, guys?
Bed and breakfast?
Temporary dwelling.
Temporary dwelling units, okay, bed and breakfast, let's do that one, that one should be pretty quick. Bed and breakfast, we again had something very similar where it was left out of one, and so it needed to be. And then the other question is, it's in everything except modular housing, or manufactured housing, and it's not in NA or BR. It is in ag, rural, LDR, MDR, HDR, and LA. So, does it make sense to have bed and breakfast? And when I say that, we're talking 2 categories, 3 and fewer, or 4 and more. And again, they're bed and breakfast. Does it make sense to have those in NA and BR? Because I don't really have an opinion on that, but I just was noticing the inconsistency.
I think the planning commission can take a look at it. Sorry, guys.
It was discussed with the zoning ordinance subcommittee, and I think the feedback that we got from Steve Largent was, desire not to have bed and breakfasts, and that was kind of where we left that with Boardman River. We didn't discuss it with NA. There's not a lot of residential development in NA, but.
And would it make a difference if it's owner occupied or not?
Well, bed and breakfast is,
Because I know the schoolhouse.
Yeah.
It's the corner of
Mhm.
and Highlight, that at one point was not owner occupied, but it was still a bed and breakfast. Not the large one, the little white square.
I think that was a number of years ago, though, maybe
It was, I just
before.
added
Yeah.
So it has. It has.
Yeah, they clarified it. I think that might have been one of the issues, and there was another one, too. That got clarified when we were doing the first version of short-term rentals. So, okay. Well, I guess, I would just, when you guys do talk about that, what's the basis of Largent's? He always has good recommendations. I'm sure that there might be a good reason, but I'd just have you maybe think about that. Okay.
Financial institutions.
Oh, that's not, if you guys do it, fine. If you don't, fine. But I'm just like, it's an office, and you have dentists there, and you had Peterson McGregor, and it's not listed, so.
We'll take that.
Okay.
Makes sense.
The only
Temp-
difference may be if there's a drive-through, if it's a banking financial
Yeah.
institution.
But I think-
You have to address drive-throughs.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a really good point. But I think you address drive-throughs in a different section, don't you? Yeah. So they wouldn't necessarily be allowed through there. Temporary, what was the other one?
Temporary dwelling unit.
Temporary dwelling unit? Okay,
Temporary dwelling?
so what's the pleasure of the board with some feedback to the planning commission?
Take it right off.
Commission wants it.
No, they probably don't, you're right. What's that, Glenn?
I think it needs to be taken out.
You would like the temporary dwellings taken out? Okay. Other thoughts? Same thoughts?
I think it's good, so.
Okay. Then,
Say, at the planning commission, we did discuss this a bit, and I think, at least as I remember it, and maybe others can correct me if I'm wrong, I think our intent was certainly not to have anybody living there, but we wanted to make an allowance for if somebody had their kids come up and they wanted to pitch a tent in the backyard or bring a camper up for the weekend and allow them to live, for the weekend there. I think that's how we kind of came up with this 7 days, or maybe Giffords and Webster came up with 7 days, 60. But certainly we didn't want to have it abused and become a living situation.
how did that even become an issue? Because kids have been putting tents in the backyard and forever, and I know when our camper was in the driveway, like, a kid might have stayed in there for fun, you know what I mean? So
Because we get calls about it, and our current ordinance doesn't allow it.
Yeah.
That's what we communicate.
Well, and I know other municipalities have the same or similar requirements or regulations. I've heard of other people talking about it, so.
Okay, so we heard Glenn and Matt's, Mindy, Tracy, Sue, Matt?
I think it gives us a way to enforce or curb it if we have something that states you can have it for this amount of time, if somebody's abusing it.
Okay.
Well, I've heard lots of comments, and I talked to Claire about this, so maybe we flush this out for everybody, is, people are concerned that this is gonna turn into the next short-term rental. And, I talked to Claire about it, and it can't be a short-term rental, it can't be rented out to,
Right.
so it can't go into that realm. But the 7 days, everybody is on edge of how are you gonna enforce that, Again, we talked about how we do enforcement in the township. The only thing I can say is maybe we take the 60 days and make that a whole lot less,
That's what I was wondering, too.
Because, I had one in my neighborhood. We had, 2 trailers in one driveway. There was a family living in the trailer for, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 days. It didn't disrupt my life at all, but I can see when you've got 7 days and then a day later you've got another trailer or the same trailer coming in, this could be.
Or they're there a month, or.
Yeah, then it could be very disruptive. And then that's when we added about the, water and sewer. What are you doing with your, your waste, and making sure that your trash gets, leave as you came kind of thing. Leave the property in a better condition than you came type of scenario. So I see the point of it. But I also see the concern of how this could go bad fast. And that 60 days, I think, might be what we need to change so that it's not, because 60 days is most of the summer. So I think maybe that's where we need to go with it.
Okay.
But I am fine taking it out, and I'm fine leaving it in if we change it a little bit.
Matt or Sue?
I think within the constraints of what the discussion has been, I think we can create something that can be worked. It's not a short-term rental, it's not a long-term fix, but it does allow friends to come and have a long weekend and stay with you in a camper or a kid pitch a tent.
Yeah.
And again, up to also, it's property size. Because if you're on a postage stamp and you bring in a 30-foot camper or motorhome, it's going to look a lot different.
Yeah, I would agree with you, and I think having something maybe with some moderate or some change standards would, though, allow those smaller areas where it makes more of an impact. It allows then something to be done. Yeah. Matt?
Yeah, I mean, I don't see, it can probably be tweaked a little bit, going to supporting what Mindy was saying about the 60-day time frame. But otherwise, I mean, what's the other extreme? You just ban them altogether?
That's where they are right now.
Yeah.
Your kid can't pitch a tent in the backyard technically right now.
No.
That's the fallbacks of permissive zoning.
No.
Kids pitch tents in the backyard since before I was ever born, believe it or not. They did have tents back then. But the thing is, it's almost like it's a can of worms that's gonna get opened because it is gonna get abused. I mean, we can take a look at any of the ordinance we got, and there's always somebody gonna abuse it. I mean, that's just common. But when you
That's
start.
why we have an ordinance, so you have a way of.
The thing is, how would you ever regulate it, especially out in the lakes area? I don't know that you're going to. My concern would be, number one, how you're gonna regulate it. Number two, what are they gonna do with the sewage?
Well, they have to take it off-site. That's in the ordinance.
I mean, ideally, you and I would say, yeah, that's what you do. That doesn't mean it's gonna happen.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And the thing is that a lot of these little houses out around the lake, I would question the capacity of what they already got for sewer systems. A lot of those houses were built back in the 40s and maybe even before then. But that's the problem you're gonna have. That's my concern for it anyhow.
I guess if I can just say one thing.
Sure.
Sometimes it appears as though the discussions we're having and the regulations we're trying to put in place would make it sound as though our community is all one big subdivision. We're not. We're still very diverse. We still have the lakes districts. We still have the agricultural. We still have the potted plants. We still have the HOAs. We have so many different diverse areas that to say it can't be allowed overall, or it has to be allowed overall, doesn't always work. I hear so much of that conversation one way or another, but we aren't all square half acres or whatever throughout. Everything is so very different. So I would still like to see some way to be able to allow it, but maybe there needs to be some of that discussion with it too.
Okay, Dan, how about that?
No.
Good to go.
Moving on.
Now I see why you are chairman.
Okay, you guys have quite a list. Did I miss anything?
I think that's all I had.
Okay. All right. Is there anything else right now under the draft zoning ordinance review and discussion?
No, I think think that the subcommittee has done a great job. Giffords Webster, I think, has done a great job listening. Staff has done a great job putting all of this together. It's a better document than what we've had. I was very excited when I saw the city of Troy and how wonderful that document is that you guys created. I am looking so forward to having something that's comprehensive and user-friendly and not reads that you have to travel through to get to what you want to get to.
Yeah,
To be able to do that interactive piece is huge.
definitely. Okay, any other comments? All right, we will move to residential lighting standards, overview of policy options and discussion only. Claire, do you want to frame this for us? What the just policy choices are and, what the issue is and our options.
Sure. So, for the lighting ordinance, the reason we're bringing it in front of the joint session tonight is just because it's been brought to the attention of the Planning Commission a number of times. Right now, the way the ordinance is drafted, the current ordinance and the new ordinance, we do regulate, we've got pretty robust dark sky standards for any commercial development, but residential is exempt. So the Planning Commission discussed the topic of residential lighting, either through, we discussed police power ordinance or zoning ordinance, and decided they would like to have some Board of Trustees input on that topic, especially if we're going down the path of exploring a police power ordinance. So if we went down the path of zoning ordinance, and I did look through, there's some really good resources online. You'll see in your packet, I included 5 different townships that all address residential lighting. They're all doing that through zoning. And so with the zoning, they're kind of looking at the dark sky, they're tying it to the dark sky, to light pollution, to those types of kind of more land use zoning related issues. I think, one issue with zoning is that all existing lighting would be grandfathered in. So the day that we adopt the ordinance, anything existing residential is permitted. And so then when we actually, when we get complaints, we go out and it's difficult to determine when it was installed.
Yeah.
I think, we can move forward and say, as we review site plans, land use permits, we make sure that the lighting is compliant. That would just be something that the zoning administrator took a look at if that was a requirement in our zoning ordinance. So as I mentioned, and I talked with Brian Graham a little bit about this, he talked about, zoning ordinance would be tied more to some of the public input that we're getting, which is the desire for dark sky, desire to curb light pollution, while a police power would be another option, but that would be primarily limited to nuisance. And so, Brian said that he would recommend us taking a look at, he didn't know for sure if it would be, legal, he would need to research it a little bit, but he said that's probably something we could add to our existing nuisance ordinance. A benefit of that would be that when you adopt that ordinance, it applies to everything across the board. A challenge, from Brian's perspective, was just the enforcement side of it. So staff would need to prove that it was a nuisance. And so that's a little bit higher bar than just kind of the straightforward, does it cut off at the horizontal plane? Is it dark sky compliant from a zoning perspective? If it's actually a nuisance, then, drafting the standards to prove that it's a nuisance is a little bit higher bar, a little bit more challenging to take a look at. So another thing to take into consideration, again, is the enforcement side of this. It would primarily be done in the evening, outside of regular office hours, just because it's difficult to enforce light pollution during the day. So that'd be another thing to take into account. But I did email a little bit with, Scenic Michigan is a nonprofit. They have done a lot of research on zoning ordinances and different communities that have enacted lighting ordinances related to that. So they've got a lot of good resources.
So Claire, right now, commercial already has to have all of the best practices with lighting, correct? Okay. All right, so questions or comments, feedback? Sue?
I respect what our attorney is saying about it being a police nuisance, but I also see it being very challenging for our prosecutor's office to take on those. I almost think it may be better as a zoning situation. I just remember the decibel thing with the noise ordinance or the fireworks or those type, it was very difficult at that time to get it to the prosecutor's office. And is that an effective way to have this happen? I think that it can be zoned, I think it can be managed that way. I have to believe we all want the dark sky. That's why we live here. We don't want to be in a big city that has lights 24/7 and you don't get to see the stars. You don't get to see the northern lights. You don't get to see those things. And I get it. You guys aren't here 24/7. I get that. But I don't know that having two CPOs, they're not here 24/7 either. I don't know, that's, doesn't help at all.
Good points, though.
I'd agree with her 100%. If you're going to adopt something, it should be zoning because it's going to come in on new and you got a chance to put it out there. And you got a way to control it for requiring what they're going to have for lights.
So Joe, is there a way within the zoning ordinance that this would apply to, well, I mean, it doesn't apply to old fixtures, but could we basically say that it's only new site plans, new builds that...
I mean, one of the principal challenges of applying it via zoning to residential development is that commercial development is governed by a site plan. So you have an approved site plan and that had a lighting plan that was part of it, where you showed us, here's what our fixtures look like, here's our photometric plan that shows where the light's going. A residence is not going to be bound by the same kind of site plan, and also you redo the lighting on a commercial site, you put a plan together and you know, it's going to be run through the township, whereas on a residential site, you go to Home Depot and you buy a lamp. And if Home Depot has a lamp that's not compliant with zoning, you probably don't know that. So you buy it and you put it on your house, and then your neighbor complains. And I think that there's no review that's intervening there to say, no, this is not a compliant fixture. Whereas on a commercial site, you get the intervening review that says you're proposing non-compliant fixtures. So that's one of the reasons that I tend to agree that it's not a zoning issue, aside from the nonconformity issue. But I mean, I guess that's just kind of my perspective on it, is that you don't have the intervening review to correct something before a fixture's put in place.
Can we, are those questions or comments?
Well, I wanted to comment on that, but I was under the understanding that all of our, even residential buildings, the plan goes in front of the county, and the county is the one that would say that East Bay has this ordinance, so these light fixtures have got to be adapted to that. So I don't see where that would be a problem.
County wouldn't enforce it, though, I don't think. I don't think county would enforce that.
Because they're enforcing the building code. I'm sure they're looking at setbacks and things, but...
But that would only be for new build, not an existing, if somebody puts up something in a big box.
That's
store.
right, yeah.
And I guess that's where I was, if I may. I think it's better to have a zoning discussion with someone that may not realize they have done something, rather than have a police officer come to their door and say that light's not appropriate. I think, to me, that's too much. I think that to go that direction, that's my own thought. I think it can be dealt with much more civilly as a zoning.
Matt and Tracy, Mindy, comments?
Well, I agree. I think it should be zoning, because that same guy that's going to Home Depot, he's going to buy it whether it's a police ordinance or and so you're still going to have to deal with the issue. I totally agree with the dark sky concept, and I know it's an issue in some places, but I do live in a very rural area, and we use those yard lights for security. And I think that's a true issue that needs to be also discussed, is that it can still be a dark sky light, but all my neighbors have their yards lit up, hopefully to keep people out of their yards. If you live in a more dense neighborhood, you have neighbors that kind of help out with that. We don't. I think it should be addressed just as a zoning issue, that we talk about that you're required to have dark sky lights and so forth. It's going to be hard to enforce at night, you're absolutely right, but it doesn't matter which way you go, it's still going to be hard to do. Someone's going to have to make a complaint and whatever. And we heard earlier that the beauty of zoning is the fact that you can go out and try to resolve the issue. And that's so that's where I'm at.
Okay. Good points. Mindy, Tracy?
I think it's going to be tough either way, so, I mean.
That's kind of what I was wondering. I was like, if I could interject real quick, we were talking, it was a zoning or police power, should it be at all in the first place?
I mean, I get the need for it or the desire for it. I don't know how, there's 200 homes in Pine Grove? How are you going to tell them that have been there for 50 years, oh, your light fixture is not compliant? And how do you know when they put it in? Because it's been changed 5 times and, I don't know. I just think that that's going to be really, really difficult. And either way, I mean, whether it's a police power or a zoning. I mean.
It could just be neighbor to neighbor issue.
Well, that's the other thing.
Well, and that's what it's been. I mean, that's what we've told them at this point. It's a civil issue between neighbors and
it is a civil issue. I mean, we've seen that with G-Tax and the neighbors over on the west side of town. There are civil options for a true nuisance like that. Mindy? If you had any feedback, you don't have to.
My thought is that this is going to be darn near impossible to enforce. If you do it as zoning or residential, it could be never, before some of these come into compliance, because the biggest thing is it's an education issue. And to go through a zoning ordinance or a police power ordinance and the time, money, and effort that is spent to make a law that we can enforce, I say that we spend the money and do education and efforts in that manner to say, hey, this is it, this is what we want to see, whether it's in the newsletters or, other training sessions, because it's going to be very, very difficult to get the residential on board. Because I know when I built my house, there was no light fixtures on my plans that were approved. I went to a Home Depot or Lowe's and bought my fixtures and slapped them up. That's how it was. Nobody looked at them.
Yeah.
I agree with points that a lot of people are making here, and support the idea that we adopt a zoning ordinance that is, supportive of some dark sky achievement here in the township, whether it's, next year or 50 years from now, when things come into compliance. I think there's to Mindy's point about the education, I think having this in place, is I think we can all agree it's going to be difficult to impossible to fully enforce. But I think there's a tremendous value in the township recognizing and having a sort of a culture shift towards that to really make it a goal. I think education's a piece of it, and I would like to see some, maybe a little bit of funding around some of that education that we could have. I think the more that townships and cities around the country adopt official ordinances around these, I think it will, sort of be it's a long-term, but probably a domino effect with other municipalities around the state and around the country that do this. And what you'll probably see is those lights that are available at Home Depot, maybe 10, 15, 20 years from now, are dark sky compliant lighting fixtures, which there's a pretty decent market for those right now, and they're out there. I think you can even go to Home Depot and pick them up as an option. But, the more, I think that should be our goal at the end of the day, is not to go around and beat people up for not having the right light fixtures on their house so much as we're, showing our, the township's desire to kind of get to an end goal there.
So if I could recap maybe and come to some consensus, I think we're recognizing the difficulty of either type of ordinance, zoning or police power, but we are also recognizing the value of the dark sky and the light pollution. So maybe in that we do some spending, utilize resources to the education and support those efforts that are out there, and we expand those, utilize them, and then save those enforcement resources, because in the end of the day, we only have, Bill has X number of time, right? Do we want him enforcing things that impact the water quality, or some other safety issues, or do we want him doing dark sky? I think the education component is probably the best, because that's where people are, they're going to do it because they want to do it, and they see the value in it.
The argument can be made that all of those are equally important in someone's eyes, or more so. But education is inexpensive if it's on the website, if it's on a handout and somebody comes in. I can see that. But what is, like I say, the water quality is up here for some folks, but the dark sky is here. They're both valued, they're both important. It's how Bill to spend, or whomever's in that seat, to spend more time doing one or the other is never going to be totally acceptable to everybody. But I do believe we can do some education on that.
Yeah, and I'll just add just a little bit of context. I shared this with, around the same conversation, shared this with Claire the past couple months. I had the opportunity to visit a really fully developed city right outside a suburb of Austin called Bee Caves, Texas. Went there, and they really have pushed, dark skies. And this is a fully developed town with, big shopping malls and everything. And had the opportunity to see this place, from the hotel at night, and you can see it. I mean, they've obviously put a lot into it, really pushed it in a lot of their planning and commercial development primarily. But even on the residential side, you notice it. You absolutely notice, when you come into this city versus the city of Austin. It's something that they've done a lot with. And to be such a densely developed area and be as dark, but yet as inviting and safe feeling as that place is pretty remarkable. So it'd be nice to live in a place that got there once that level of development happened.
Okay. Did we frame some feedback for you as planning commissioners, do you think, regarding that? Okay. All right. Matt, what I like is, your comments remind me of, once you're a planning commissioner or township board member, you don't travel the same way. You see communities different when you go places. It's very interesting. Any other discussion or comments, planning commission or township board, related to, we're on item 8B, the residential lighting standards? Okay, we'll move on to public comment. This is the second and last opportunity for public comment. If there is any public comment, please feel free to come up. And it is on separate issues, so if you've already spoken on an issue. Oh, you haven't spoken? Well, come on up, of course. Sorry. Sure. Absolutely. I apologize, I didn't realize you hadn't spoke earlier.
You caught me, I was talking out of turn over there, unfortunately, talking, so I apologize for that.
Nope, you're good.
Just Todd Biggs, lifelong resident of Arbutus Lake. Coming in and hearing everyone get a chance to talk, first of all, I appreciate all your time and effort and what you guys do for the township. It's a heavy task, and I appreciate it. And by sitting in through the whole meeting, you see what it takes, so I appreciate you. Thanks for that. What I wanted to talk about is something that was addressed with the landscapers earlier, and I know that Claire, in the position that she's in, through my research and speaking with her, she had advocated for the permeable pavers, and through her research and information, I've heard a lot of things brought up about pros and cons and education and green structure and environmental and pollution. And I really feel like, as it was brought up, and reiterating to that, it's an opportunity to really set forth and preserve our shorelines and our lakefront as a lakefront property owner, and with children and planning on being here hopefully for a long time, to have an opportunity to do that with the township and the commission working toward allowing that. I think, you go through pros and cons and different materials, and, wood rots, and it's got arsenic, and it's treated, and it's not something that a lot of, it's not healthy, it's not good, but then you look at a solid structure like permeable pavers, and there's something that can really last the test of time and not deteriorate, not rot, and I just feel that, as they had mentioned, it's an opportunity to really move in the right direction to kind of preserve and protect our shorelines and waterways. So that's my public comment, and that's it.
All right, very good, thank you. Any additional public comment? Hi, Judy. On a different topic than earlier?
Well, no, I think you need to look at temporary dwellings, because it doesn't say that you have to have a primary dwelling on that land. It doesn't say how many tents, how many RVs. Remember, you can store 4. So are you going to end up having a campground? I really think you need to look at those by districts, because you're opening up a problem. And I think we have to have some common sense. It's not about your grandkids or my grandkids. If you have common sense, you're probably going to say, okay, it's a couple kids in the backyard, but you get a couple people drinking and yelling and screaming, it's a different story. So let's use common sense too. I'm not going to complain about, a tent in the backyard if there's a primary dwelling. Otherwise, I'm building a latrine, and I'm on a slope, and that's all going to run downhill. So we better be thinking about what we're doing here. Plus, people invested, built homes in an area, they researched the zoning, and now you're changing it. Think about that. It's not just grandkids or this, it's people that built homes with the understanding that there weren't these temporary dwellings permitted. AUDs, let's talk about that.
ADUs?
Yeah, sorry.
That's okay.
ADUs. We have to talk about the infrastructure, and I think that was right to talk about, do we have the septics? Are you going to bring municipal water and septic out to the areas to support these accessory dwelling units? Are you going to check septics? The state says 46% of the septics are non-functioning up to standards. 25% are not functioning at all. We did a study on septic permits that were on file with Celery Bay. There are 3 homes that have no permits on file. That means they either might have a steel drum, or they might be not having anything but leaching into the lake. There are no permits on file. We don't know where their septics are. We don't know what kind of septics they have. I'd like to talk about recreation. The lakes area, the Boardman River, and the natural area probably has the most parks of any area in the township. We also have Brown Bridge Quiet Area, which we just enhanced. The Conservancy as well, on September 1, will maybe take the old part of Camp Graylick and turn that into a recreation park. We have a state campground in the lakes area. And I think, there's a lot of recreation. We have 16 lakes, with the largest one being 456 acres of public trust. So let's talk about, I think we have recreation, and I'm not sure what the definition of recreating is, but I think that area has really, are we going to overuse the planet? We've got to think about that too. We can't just keep adding when you go to the national parks now, you can't just take your car to the road to the sun. You have to apply a year in advance to get a permit. We cannot continue to overuse this planet. So I would just remind you that we have a city, possibly a county park, we have a state campground, and we have a lot of township parks in those districts. So I appreciate it if we really take a spin around the township and really look what we have. Thank you very much.
For additional public comment? Carol, on a different topic than what you spoke on this, at the first public comment.
In regards to the outdoor storage, I believe that it's currently written as 4 vehicles, or what are those vehicles? And are they licensed? Are they functioning? I came from a township where it was that the vehicle had to be functioning, it had to be licensed, currently licensed. So take that into consideration when you're reviewing that. And what are the vehicles? Landscape trailers, boat trailers, cars, trucks, campers, snowmobiles, recreational vehicles. What is all that? Maybe I didn't read it sufficiently enough, but perhaps that needs to be in there. Thank you for your discussion tonight, especially about the temporary dwelling units. I really like the ideas about considering them by districts and also considering the lot size. And I appreciate your comment there, Beth, but please look at the information that I gave you in your email, the resources that I gave you about nighttime lighting. There are stores that are already selling this type of lighting, and it has special codes on it that shows that it's the dark skies lighting. And also on the website for the International Dark Skies, one of the points that came out from a Harvard research paper is that 94% of lawsuits brought against municipalities and other government entities about lighting were based on too much lighting as opposed to insufficient lighting. Thank you for your hard work.
Additional public comment? Sir, a comment on something different than what you did? Okay, good, thank you.
One thing that I did notice in here that I think should be addressed and discussed amongst you guys is the limitations, restrictions of retaining walls. That wasn't talked about tonight. I think it's vital to talk about because some of these homes are right on the lake. There's steep slopes. There's erosion that's happening that's going into the lakes. Under a lot of tree canopy, there's not a lot of undergrowth. There's sandy soils. A new home gets built or a new driveway gets built upland of that. That's within your 20% maximum impervious space. It's going to wash out into the lake. If you can, have a retaining wall that is a vital piece of infrastructure on a site, and to have it prohibited unless the township engineer verification is integral to the principal structure or the critical facilities on the site, that means the only way to do it is hold up a house, to me, and or a garage or something. And to say that you can't have a retaining wall at all in the Lake District or in the sensitive environmental area is pretty ridiculous, in my opinion. My parents have a place on Bass Lake. There's a retaining wall there. That's the only way they can access the lakefront is to have that there. And I know that there's many other people that have retaining walls. I know there's some really obscene ones that likely drove this to being a requirement, but to
totally cut retaining walls off in an entire district, is how I'm reading it, is something that should definitely be discussed. There's no landscaping walls allowed in anyone's lot in an entire district. How are you, that's just if, I'm, the heir to the property that's on the Lake District, and I think that's going to be, that's highly restrictive, to have nothing that's incentivizing them to do it right and have it engineered. I see many places within this ordinance that's requiring a landscape architect or an engineer and all these other certifications. That should be enough for you guys for these types of things. If someone is putting their stamp and their professional integrity behind something, that should be enough. You don't have to police it if their license and their insurance is backing it. You're requiring it within the ordinance, many different places. So if you're, it reads that, a landscape architect needs to do the tree plan or other things. If something happens with that, I have professional liability. If someone gets hurt on one of my designs, my professional liability takes care of that. If it fails, my insurance takes care of that. So that if you're requiring that a landscape architect or an engineer has to do something, that should be enough. So that's a point that, I really think that you guys should look at. And, why prohibit something that can be easily specified with guideline and specifications and details within your ordinances? Same with the green infrastructure piece. Have very clear guidelines of what you require.
You can wrap up, that would be great.
Sure, and I think that another thing that I think is a really good thing, I'm glad to hear the green infrastructure is being worked on, but the incentivization of green infrastructure and other things. All the water, it doesn't, just the Lake District isn't the only district that is sending water to the bay. So I think that there's a lot of ways for you to really help and improve with incentives. You talked about the hotels and other things, the units, how many units on a site. There's the low density and high density and discussions of that. If it's too many, 5 is too many on a 1 acre lot or whatever it was. Why not make it a requirement if the developer wants to go that way, that if they do green infrastructure, manage water, plant more trees, incentivize, don't just give it to them. Make them work for it. Make them make the township better by managing the water in a different way or putting more landscaping in. And then the final note is I plant 100% natives at my company. I recommend that you guys define what native is. It's not in the definitions that I've seen anywhere. And is it native to Northwest Michigan? Is it native to Michigan, North America? That's something that there's a broad openness there from my seat where we do 100% native plants. So I recommend that you just define it a little further. I'd love to see it there because that's what we do. But I really recommend that it's just more specific because native is just pretty a general term, so.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Any further public comment? Okay, our upcoming meeting dates, Planning Commission is August 7th, 6:30. Our Township Board is August 12th, and then you as well have an additional special Planning Commission meeting on August 20th at 6:30. So thank you for your time tonight, and if there are no objections, then we stand adjourned. Have a good evening, everybody.